What if I told you that a single execution, a father thrown into a pit of venomous snakes, would trigger the largest military invasion England had ever seen? What if I told you that four brothers, driven by blood vengeance and burning ambition, would assemble an army so massive, so disciplined, so utterly terrifying that it would bring four kingdoms to their knees in less than a decade? This is not a legend. This is not a myth. This is the true story of the great heathen army, and by the end of this, you will understand why medieval chroniclers called them the wrath of God himself. But here is what nobody tells you about the Vikings. They were not mindless barbarians swinging axes at random targets. They were strategic geniuses, master manipulators, and military innovators who would have made Sun Tzu proud. And the great heathen army? They were the absolute pinnacle of Viking military evolution. So buckle up, because what you are about to hear will completely change everything you thought you knew about the Viking Age. The year is 865 AD, and Scandinavia is a powder keg waiting to explode. Picture this: thousands of young men with no land, no inheritance, no future. The traditional practice of partible inheritance meant that when a father died, his land was divided equally among all his sons. Sounds fair, right? Wrong. After a few generations, you have plots of land so small they cannot feed a single family. You have younger sons with nothing but their sword arm and their ambition. You have an entire generation of warriors with absolutely nothing to lose and everything to gain. But wait, it gets worse. The climate is changing. The medieval warm period is creating chaos across northern Europe. Coastal flooding is destroying traditional settlements. Weather patterns are shifting unpredictably. Trade routes that families had relied upon for generations are suddenly disrupted. And the political situation, absolute chaos. Denmark is fragmented into dozens of petty kingdoms, each one fighting the others for dominance. Norway is being forcibly unified under Harald Fairhair, and anyone who refuses to submit is being driven into exile. Sweden is a patchwork of competing interests with no central authority. Now here is where it gets really interesting. The silver trade routes that had fueled Scandinavian economies for generations are collapsing. The Volga river system that connected Scandinavia with the Islamic world through the Khazar Khaganate is being disrupted by political instability and the expansion of Magyar tribes into the Pontic steppe. Arabic silver, the lifeblood of Viking commerce, is drying up. And when the money stops flowing, desperate men start looking for alternative sources of wealth. Enter England, rich, divided, and utterly unprepared for what was coming. The monasteries were overflowing with gold and silver accumulated over centuries of pious donations. The trading centers were bustling with valuable goods from across Europe. The agricultural surplus was substantial enough to feed armies for years. And the political situation? 4 separate kingdoms, each one suspicious of the others, each one more concerned with their neighbors than with external threats. It was like leaving a vault full of gold with the door wide open and a sign saying, "Please help yourself." But the Vikings had raided England before. They had been hitting coastal monasteries for decades, grabbing what they could and sailing home before anyone could organize a response. So what made 865 AD different? What transformed scattered raiding parties into the most formidable military force the British Isles had ever seen? The answer lies in a snake pit in Northumbria and a father named Ragnar Lothbrok. Now, I need to be honest with you here. The historical existence of Ragnar Lothbrok is hotly debated among modern scholars. Some believe he was a real person whose exploits were later exaggerated into legend. Others think he was a composite figure, a mythological amalgamation of several different Viking leaders whose stories became intertwined over centuries of oral tradition. But here is what we know for certain. His sons were absolutely real, and their actions are documented in multiple contemporary sources, including the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. According to the sagas, Ragnar was captured during a raid on Northumbria and brought before King Aella. What happened next would echo through history for generations. Aella, seeking to make an example of the famous Viking raider, had Ragnar thrown into a pit filled with venomous snakes. As the serpents struck again and again, Ragnar reportedly laughed and said, "How the little pigs would grunt if they knew the situation of the old boar." He was referring to his sons, and he was absolutely right to do so. When news of Ragnar's death reached Scandinavia, his sons did not weep, they did not mourn. They began planning the largest military expedition in Viking history. Ivar the Boneless, the eldest and most cunning, became the strategic mastermind behind the operation. Halfdan Ragnarsson brought his reputation as a fearless warrior and his extensive connections among Danish military leaders. Ubba contributed his unparalleled naval expertise and his knowledge of English coastal defenses. Sigurd Snake in the Eye provided political connections and diplomatic skills that would prove crucial for maintaining coalition unity. But here is what makes this truly remarkable. These four brothers did not just want revenge, they wanted conquest. They wanted to take everything England had and make it their own. And they had the intelligence, the resources, and the ruthlessness to actually pull it off. The recruitment process that followed was unlike anything Scandinavia had ever seen. The brothers sent messengers to every corner of the Norse world, calling warriors to their banner with promises of wealth, glory, and vengeance. They did not just recruit professional fighters. They recruited blacksmiths who could repair weapons in the field. They recruited carpenters who could build siege engines and fortifications. They recruited sailors who could navigate the treacherous North Sea in any weather. They recruited farmers who understood logistics and supply chains. They created not just an army, but a self-sustaining military machine capable of operating thousands of miles from home for years at a time. The response was overwhelming. Danish warriors poured in from Jutland, Zealand, and the Danish islands, bringing experience from conflicts with the Frankish Empire and familiarity with siege warfare techniques learned during campaigns against Carolingian fortifications. Norwegian exiles displaced by Harald Fairhair's consolidation efforts saw an opportunity to rebuild their fortunes. Swedish contingents from Gotaland and Svealand contributed ships and warriors in exchange for shares of expected plunder. By the summer of 865 AD, the brothers had assembled between 5,000 and 8,000 combat-effective warriors, supported by thousands more camp followers, craftsmen, and support personnel. The fleet that would carry this army to England numbered between 200 and 300 vessels of various sizes. The largest were dragon ships capable of carrying 60 to 80 warriors each, their carved prows designed to strike terror into anyone who saw them approaching. Smaller coastal vessels provided reconnaissance and supply transport capabilities. The logistical challenge of coordinating such a massive fleet was staggering, but the brothers had planned for everything. They established supply depots along the English coast, using advance parties disguised as traders. They coordinated with existing Scandinavian trading networks to ensure access to food and materials. They developed standardized weapon designs that could be manufactured and repaired efficiently in the field. They created a sophisticated command structure that allowed different contingents to operate independently while maintaining strategic coordination. They were not just planning a raid, they were planning a conquest. And as the autumn winds began to favor eastward travel across the North Sea, the great heathen army set sail for England. The Anglo-Saxons had no idea what was coming. They thought they understood Vikings. They thought they knew how to deal with raiders. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. The crossing itself was a masterpiece of naval coordination. The fleet approached the English coast in multiple waves, with advanced reconnaissance vessels identifying suitable landing sites along the East Anglian shoreline several days before the main force arrived. Contemporary sources indicate the Vikings made landfall near modern-day Great Yarmouth. though archaeological evidence suggests multiple landing points were utilized to distribute the logistical burden and reduce the risk of concentrated Anglo-Saxon resistance. The initial beaching operations demonstrated capabilities that no previous Viking expedition had possessed. The larger dragon ships, drawing too much water to approach the shore directly, anchored in deeper water, while smaller vessels ferried warriors, equipment, and supplies to the beach. The army's engineers had prepared portable wooden platforms that could be quickly assembled to create temporary docks, allowing for rapid unloading of heavy items, including dismantled siege equipment, iron ingots for weapon repair, and substantial quantities of preserved food supplies. East Anglia had been chosen with surgical precision. The kingdom jutted into the North Sea with extensive coastline that provided multiple escape routes if retreat became necessary. The relatively flat terrain favored the mobile warfare tactics that formed the foundation of Viking military doctrine. Numerous rivers provided inland transportation routes for the shallow draft vessels that accompanied the main fleet. And most importantly, East Anglia was weak. King Edmund, who had ruled since around 855 AD, commanded a kingdom that lacked the military resources and fortification systems of larger Anglo-Saxon realms like Wessex or Mercia. The East Anglian army consisted primarily of the king's personal retinue and levies drawn from local thegns, totaling perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 warriors at full mobilization. Against 5,000 to 8,000 Viking warriors, they never stood a chance. But the Vikings did not attack immediately. That is what makes them so terrifying. They did not behave like raiders, they behaved like conquerors. They constructed a fortified camp using a combination of earthworks and wooden palisades, following defensive principles developed during previous campaigns against Frankish forces. They established tributary relationships with local populations, demanding regular payments of food, silver, and other supplies in exchange for protection from Viking raids. They acquired horses from East Anglian breeding centers and began training their warriors in cavalry tactics. They sent scouts throughout eastern England, mapping road networks, identifying river crossings, and assessing the defensive capabilities of potential targets. For nearly a year, the great heathen army sat in East Anglia growing stronger, while the rest of England grew more terrified. Reports of the army's size, discipline, and military effectiveness spread throughout Anglo-Saxon England, creating widespread fear and uncertainty about future Viking intentions. Monasteries began hiding their treasures and relocating valuable manuscripts to more secure locations. Local populations in vulnerable areas started constructing defensive works or preparing for potential evacuation. And the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms? They did nothing. King Burgred of Mercia focused on defending his own territories rather than providing military assistance to Edmund. King Ethelred of Wessex concentrated on strengthening his own defenses rather than organizing a coalition response. The fragmented nature of English political authority meant that no effective mechanism existed for coordinating a unified response to the Viking invasion. Each kingdom was on its own. By the spring of 866 AD, the Great Heathen Army had transformed from a seaborne raiding force into a land-based military organization, capable of sustained territorial campaigns. They had new logistical systems, new tactical doctrines, new organizational structures. They had horses, siege equipment, and detailed intelligence about every major Anglo-Saxon stronghold. They were ready, and their first target was the largest Anglo-Saxon kingdom of them all, Northumbria. The march north began in late 866 AD, and it was unlike anything England had ever witnessed. This was not a raiding party moving quickly to avoid detection. This was an army on the move, confident in its power, daring anyone to stand in its way. The Great Heathen Army followed the ancient Roman road system, their main force traveling along Ermine Street through the heart of Anglo-Saxon England. Mounted scouts ranged far ahead of the main column, identifying potential threats and suitable camping sites. Supply wagons pulled by oxen acquired in East Anglia carried portable forges, siege materials, and substantial quantities of iron weapons. The transformation that had occurred during their East Anglian sojourn was immediately apparent. Unlike traditional Viking raiding parties that relied primarily on riverine transport, the Great Heathen Army now operated as a combined arms force capable of rapid overland movement. They had cavalry, they had siege engineers, they had a comprehensive support system that included camp followers, craftsmen, and merchants who provided services ranging from weapon repair to food preparation. This expanded military community numbered perhaps 12,000 to 15,000 individuals, making it one of the largest organized forces operating in 9th century Europe. But here is what made their target selection so brilliant. Northumbria in 866 AD was the largest Anglo-Saxon kingdom by territorial extent, stretching from the Humber River northward to the Scottish borders and encompassing much of modern Yorkshire, Durham, and Northumberland. On paper, it should have been the hardest kingdom to conquer. In reality, it was the easiest, because Northumbria was tearing itself apart. The civil war that would prove so advantageous to Viking conquest had erupted in 862 AD, when Osbert, who had ruled Northumbria since 849 AD, faced a challenge from Aella, a nobleman whose exact genealogical claims remain unclear from surviving sources. Yes, that Aella. The same king who had thrown Ragnar Lothbrok into the snake pit. The same king whose actions had triggered this entire invasion. And now his kingdom was divided, his armies were fighting each other, and the sons of Ragnar were marching north with vengeance in their hearts. The irony is almost too perfect. Aella had killed Ragnar to make an example, to show the Vikings that Northumbria was not to be trifled with. Instead, he had signed his own death warrant and doomed his entire kingdom. Osbert's power base centered on the traditional Northumbrian heartland around Bamber and extended southward through the river valleys of the Tyne and Wear. His supporters included many established noble families whose landholdings had been granted by previous kings, along with ecclesiastical authorities who valued political stability over dynastic legitimacy. His forces consisted primarily of his personal retinue and levies drawn from loyal thegns, totaling perhaps 3,000 warriors when fully mobilized. Aella's faction drew strength from newer noble families and regional leaders who had been excluded from Osbert's inner circle. His support extended through the southern portions of Northumbria, particularly around York and the fertile agricultural regions of the Vale of York. His military forces included substantial numbers of younger warriors, attracted by promises of land grants and elevated status following victory. His army may have numbered 2,500 to 3,000 men. The Viking intelligence network had provided detailed information about this civil war and its potential exploitation. Scandinavian traders and raiders had maintained contacts within Northumbria for decades, creating relationships that now proved invaluable for military planning. The Vikings understood that neither Osbert nor Aella commanded sufficient resources to resist a determined invasion while simultaneously fighting each other. More importantly, the civil war had disrupted the kingdom's defensive preparations and prevented the coordination necessary for effective resistance against external threats. The great heathen army's advance into Northumbrian territory proceeded with minimal resistance. Local populations, exhausted by years of civil conflict, offered little opposition to the Viking forces. The army's mounted scouts reported that neither Osbert nor Aella had positioned significant forces to contest the Viking approach, apparently believing that their mutual conflict took precedence over the external threat. This strategic miscalculation would prove fatal to both claimants and decisive for Viking conquest of the kingdom. York, known to the Anglo-Saxons as Eoforwick, the most valuable strategic prize in Northumbria and the obvious target for Viking conquest. The city occupied a commanding position at the confluence of the rivers Ouse and Foss, controlling river traffic throughout the region and serving as the administrative center for the southern portions of the kingdom. York's importance extended beyond its military and political significance. The city functioned as a major trading hub, connecting Northumbria with continental Europe, and served as the seat of an archbishop, whose influence extended throughout northern England. The physical defenses of York in 866 AD reflected both Roman engineering and Anglo-Saxon modifications developed over several centuries. The city retained substantial portions of its Roman walls, constructed from local limestone and standing approximately 15 feet high with regular interval towers. The Anglo-Saxons had repaired and extended these fortifications, adding wooden palisades and earthwork barriers to protect areas of expansion beyond the original Roman perimeter. The defensive system included 4 main gates, each protected by barbican structures and capable of withstanding prolonged siege operations. Any other army would have looked at those walls and hesitated. The great heathen army looked at them and saw an opportunity. The Viking approach to York demonstrated sophisticated siege warfare techniques that had been developed during campaigns against Frankish fortifications. The army established multiple camps surrounding the city, cutting off supply routes and preventing communication between the defenders and potential relief forces. Viking engineers began construction of siege equipment, including battering rams, scaling ladders, and catapults capable of launching stones and incendiary materials over the city walls. The preparation phase extended over several weeks, during which the Vikings systematically eliminated outlying defensive positions and tightened their control over the surrounding countryside. The defenders of York faced an impossible strategic situation as the Viking siege intensified during the autumn of 866 AD. The city's garrison consisted primarily of Aella's supporters, as he had gained control of York during the earlier phases of the Civil War. However, the garrison numbered fewer than 1,000 effective warriors, insufficient to man the entire defensive perimeter against a force of 6,000 to 8,000 Viking attackers. The civilian population, swollen by refugees from the surrounding countryside, strained the city's food supplies and created additional pressure on the defenders. But here is where the Vikings showed their true genius. They did not just attack the walls, they attacked the minds of the defenders. The army's engineers diverted water sources that supplied the city, forcing the defenders to rely on internal wells and stored supplies. Viking archers and slingers maintained constant harassment of defenders, attempting to man the walls, while work parties constructed approach trenches that would enable assault forces to reach the walls under cover. And then came the psychological warfare. The army's leaders arranged for captured Northumbrian nobles to be executed within sight of the city walls, demonstrating the fate awaiting those who continued to resist. Viking war cries and weapon displays created constant noise and visual intimidation. The systematic burning of nearby settlements sent clear messages about the consequences of defiance. Day after day, night after night, the pressure never stopped. The defenders could not sleep. They could not rest. They could only watch as their doom approached. The breakthrough came in November 866 AD, when Viking assault forces successfully breached the city's eastern wall through a combination of undermining and direct assault. The attack began before dawn, with Viking archers providing covering fire, while assault teams advanced under the protection of portable shields and wooden mantlets. The defenders, weakened by months of siege conditions and constant harassment, could not maintain effective resistance along the entire defensive perimeter. Once the Vikings established a foothold within the walls, the organized defense collapsed rapidly as panic spread throughout the city. The capture of York proceeded with characteristic Viking efficiency and brutality. The army's leadership had planned the assault to minimize damage to valuable infrastructure while eliminating organized resistance. Viking forces moved systematically through the city, securing key buildings including the royal palace, the cathedral, and the main market areas. Resistance from individual defenders was crushed quickly, though the Vikings showed pragmatic restraint in their treatment of craftsmen, merchants, and other civilians whose skills would prove valuable for future administration of the conquered territory. The wealth discovered within York exceeded even optimistic Viking expectations and validated their strategic decision to target Northumbria's primary city. The royal treasury contained substantial quantities of silver accumulated through taxation and tribute payments from throughout the kingdom. The cathedral and associated religious buildings yielded additional treasures including decorated manuscripts, precious metalwork, and religious artifacts that could be melted down or traded for strategic materials. The city's merchant community possessed stocks of high-value goods, including silk, spices, and manufactured items from continental Europe. But the Vikings were not satisfied with just taking York. They wanted to destroy any possibility of Northumbrian resistance. And that meant dealing with both Osbert and Aella. The news of York's fall prompted desperate attempts by both rival kings to organize relief expeditions, though their efforts remained hampered by mutual distrust and limited military resources. Contemporary sources suggest that initial attempts at cooperation occurred during the winter of 866 to 867 AD, with both claimants recognizing that Viking control of York threatened their respective positions regardless of the civil war's outcome. However, negotiations between the rival factions proved difficult as each leader demanded recognition of his legitimate authority as the price for military cooperation. Eventually, desperation overcame distrust. Osbert and Aella negotiated a temporary alliance that subordinated their dynastic dispute to the immediate necessity of expelling the Viking invaders. Their combined forces numbered approximately 5,000 warriors, representing the largest Anglo-Saxon army assembled in Northumbria for several decades. The alliance army included both claimants' personal retinues, levies from loyal thegns throughout the kingdom, and volunteers motivated by religious fervor against the heathen invaders. They marched on York with confidence born of numerical parity and intimate knowledge of the local terrain. Osbert and Aella had developed a coordinated battle plan that called for simultaneous attacks against multiple sections of the city's defenses, preventing the Vikings from concentrating their forces effectively. The Anglo-Saxon leaders expected that their superior knowledge of York's defensive weaknesses would compensate for any disadvantages in equipment or tactical sophistication. They were wrong. The Battle of York, fought on March 21, 867 AD, became one of the most decisive engagements in early English history. The Viking defenders, commanded by Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson, had prepared extensively for the expected Anglo-Saxon counterattack. The city's defenses had been strengthened with additional earthworks and obstacles designed to channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones. Viking archers and crossbowmen occupied elevated positions that provided clear fields of fire across the approaches to the city walls. The initial Anglo-Saxon assault achieved limited success as attacking forces breached the outer defensive works at several points. However, the Vikings had prepared layered defenses that drew the attackers into increasingly disadvantageous positions, As Anglo-Saxon forces advanced through the breached sections, they encountered prepared obstacles including concealed pits, sharpened stakes, and carefully positioned stone barriers that disrupted their formations and exposed them to concentrated missile fire from Viking defenders. And then came the trap. The decisive moment came when Ivar the Boneless ordered a coordinated counterattack that caught the Anglo-Saxon forces while they were engaged with the city's inner defenses. Viking cavalry units, which had been concealed outside the city during the initial assault, struck the Anglo-Saxon flanks, while infantry forces launched coordinated sorties from multiple gates. The combination of surprise, superior tactical coordination, and advantageous positioning proved overwhelming for the Anglo-Saxon army, whose formations disintegrated under the pressure of simultaneous attacks from multiple directions. Both Osbert and Aella died during the battle. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle records that both kings fell fighting bravely against overwhelming odds, while later Scandinavian sources provide more detailed accounts of their capture and execution. According to the sagas, Aella was subjected to the Blood Eagle, a ritualistic execution method in which the victim's ribs were severed from the spine and their lungs pulled out through the opening to create the appearance of wings. Whether this actually happened or was a later literary embellishment remains debated, but one thing is certain: the sons of Ragnar had their revenge. The destruction of the combined Anglo-Saxon army effectively ended organized resistance to Viking rule in Northumbria. The surviving Anglo-Saxon nobles either fled to neighboring kingdoms or submitted to the new Scandinavian authorities in hopes of preserving their lands and status. The psychological impact of the defeat extended throughout northern England, as news of the disaster convinced many potential resistors that opposition to Viking conquest was futile. The great heathen army had achieved complete control over England's largest kingdom through a combination of strategic planning, tactical innovation, and ruthless exploitation of Anglo-Saxon political divisions. They had conquered Northumbria in less than a year, and they were just getting started. The transformation of York into the stronghold of Jorvik began immediately following the city's capture. The army's leadership recognized that effective control of Northumbria required more than military occupation. They needed to establish administrative systems capable of extracting resources while maintaining order among the conquered population. The Vikings appointed local officials who could communicate effectively with Anglo-Saxon subjects while remaining loyal to their new Scandinavian overlords. This pragmatic approach reflected lessons learned from earlier Viking settlements in Ireland and the Frankish territories. Viking craftsmen began construction of new defensive works designed to protect against potential Anglo-Saxon counterattacks, while accommodating the army's specific tactical requirements. The modifications included strengthened gates, additional watchtowers, and improved communication systems that could coordinate defensive responses across the entire urban area. Simultaneously, the Vikings established workshops for weapon production, ship repair, and other military necessities that would support extended occupation of the conquered territory. The administrative structure implemented in Jorvik demonstrated the sophisticated governmental concepts that the Viking leadership had developed during their campaigns. Rather than imposing purely Scandinavian systems, the conquerors adapted existing Anglo-Saxon administrative practices to serve their own purposes. Local taxation systems continued to operate under Viking supervision, while traditional legal procedures remained in effect for disputes involving Anglo-Saxon subjects. This hybrid approach minimized disruption to daily life, while ensuring that the benefits of conquest flowed to the Viking leadership. Northumbria had fallen. The largest Anglo-Saxon kingdom was now under Viking control, and as the brothers looked south toward Mercia and Wessex, they knew that the real conquest was only beginning. The complete subjugation of Northumbria provided the great heathen army with unprecedented strategic advantages for their next phase of conquest. The capture of Jorvik had yielded substantial wealth, while the destruction of both rival Anglo-Saxon claimants eliminated any possibility of organized resistance from the north. More significantly, the victory demonstrated to other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that the Vikings possessed both the military capability and political sophistication necessary to conquer and hold major territorial acquisitions. The psychological impact of Northumbria's fall reverberated throughout England, fundamentally altering the strategic calculations of remaining Anglo-Saxon rulers. But here is what made the Viking leadership truly exceptional. They did not rush. They did not let their success go to their heads. They analyzed, they planned, and they chose their next target with surgical precision. Mercia, the geographical heart of Anglo-Saxon England, the kingdom that controlled crucial river systems, including the Trent, Severn, and Upper Thames, that provided access to virtually every other kingdom. The realm whose extensive borders touched Wessex to the south, Wales to the west, and the remnants of various smaller kingdoms throughout central England. Control of Mercia would effectively isolate Wessex, while providing the Vikings with secure supply lines connecting their Northumbrian stronghold with potential future conquests in southern England. King Burgred of Mercia presented a more formidable opponent than the divided Northumbrian leadership had offered. Burgred had ruled since 852 AD and possessed extensive experience managing both internal political challenges and external military threats. His marriage to Ethelswith, sister of King Ethelred of Wessex, had created a formal alliance between the two most powerful remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. This relationship provided Mercia with potential access to West Saxon military assistance, while offering Wessex strategic depth against Viking attacks from the north. The Mercian military organization reflected the kingdom's position as the traditional hegemon of central England. Burgred commanded a standing army built around his personal retinue of approximately 800 professional warriors, supplemented by levies that could theoretically mobilize 4,000 to 5,000 additional fighters during major campaigns. The kingdom's military infrastructure included a network of fortified positions known as burhs, strategically positioned to control river crossings and major roadways throughout Mercian territory. These defensive installations had been constructed during the 8th century and represented some of the most sophisticated military engineering in contemporary Europe. The economic resources available to Mercia made the kingdom particularly attractive to Viking conquest ambitions. The realm's agricultural productivity, enhanced by extensive drainage projects in the river valleys, generated substantial grain surpluses that could support large military forces throughout extended campaigns. Mercian control of major trading routes connecting northern and southern England produced significant customs revenues. The kingdom's silver mines in the Peak District provided access to the precious metals necessary for maintaining military forces and conducting diplomatic negotiations. In other words, Mercia was rich, powerful, and well defended. It was exactly the kind of target that would have deterred any ordinary army. The Great Heathen Army was not ordinary. The Viking approach to Mercia began during the summer of 867 AD with systematic intelligence gathering and preliminary raids designed to assess Anglo-Saxon defensive capabilities. Small Viking forces, typically numbering 200 to 300 warriors, struck targets throughout eastern Mercia while avoiding direct confrontation with major Anglo-Saxon armies. These reconnaissance operations provided detailed information about road networks, river crossings, and the location of defensive installations, while simultaneously testing Mercian response times and tactical doctrines. The main Viking advance into Mercia commenced in late autumn 867 AD. Following established patterns of seasonal campaigning that had proved successful in Northumbria, the Great Heathen Army moved southward from Jorvik along the Roman road network, with mounted scouts ranging far ahead of the main column to identify potential ambush sites and suitable defensive positions. The army's logistical organization had evolved considerably since their initial landing in East Anglia, incorporating lessons learned from their successful Northumbrian campaign about the requirements for sustained territorial conquest. The Viking force that entered Mercia represented the most sophisticated military organization operating in 9th century Europe. The army maintained its basic structure of Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish contingents, while developing specialized units optimized for specific tactical roles. Heavy cavalry equipped with mail armor and armed with long spears provided shock capability for battlefield engagements. Light cavalry units served reconnaissance and harassment functions, using composite bows and javelins to disrupt enemy formations while maintaining mobility advantages. Infantry forces included both heavily armed warriors capable of sustained melee combat and specialized units trained in siege warfare techniques. Their target was Nottingham, a settlement that commanded the Trent River crossing at a point where multiple Roman roads converged, providing access to territories extending from the Welsh borders to the North Sea coast. The town's elevated position on sandstone cliffs offered natural defensive advantages, while its location at the junction of several river valleys provided multiple escape routes if retreat became necessary. Archaeological evidence suggests that Nottingham had been fortified since the 7th century, with successive generations of Anglo-Saxon rulers strengthening its defensive capabilities. The approach to Nottingham revealed the tactical evolution that had occurred within the Great Heathen Army since their initial campaigns. Rather than attempting immediate assault against prepared defenses, the Vikings established a comprehensive siege that combined military pressure with economic warfare designed to exhaust defender resources. The army constructed multiple fortified camps surrounding the town, each positioned to control specific approach routes while providing mutual support against potential relief expeditions. Viking engineers began systematic construction of siege equipment, including battering rams, catapults, and mobile towers that could bring attacking forces to the level of the defensive walls. The siege operations demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both military engineering and psychological warfare. Viking forces diverted water sources that supplied the town, forcing defenders to rely on internal wells and stored supplies that could not sustain a prolonged siege. Simultaneously, the attackers established a comprehensive blockade that prevented food, weapons, or reinforcements from reaching the defenders. The Vikings employed captured Anglo-Saxon prisoners to construct siege equipment under the observation of the town's defenders, creating psychological pressure while conserving their own manpower for combat operations. King Burgred's response to the Viking siege of Nottingham reflected both the strengths and limitations of 9th century Anglo-Saxon military organization. The Mercian king recognized that the loss of such a strategically important position would compromise his ability to defend the remainder of his kingdom. However, Burgred also understood that direct assault against prepared Viking positions would likely result in catastrophic casualties that would leave Mercia defenseless against subsequent attacks. The king chose instead to seek military assistance from his West Saxon allies while attempting to organize a relief expedition using forces drawn from throughout his kingdom. The diplomatic negotiations between Mercia and Wessex during the winter of 867 to 868 revealed the complex political calculations involved in Anglo-Saxon resistance to Viking conquest. King Aethelred of Wessex faced pressure from his own nobles, many of whom argued that West Saxon resources should be preserved for defending their own territories, rather than expended in foreign campaigns. However, Ethelred recognized that Mercia's collapse would expose Wessex to direct Viking attack from multiple directions, making some level of military assistance strategically necessary despite its immediate costs. The joint Anglo-Saxon relief expedition that assembled during early 868 AD represented the largest English military force mobilized since the Viking invasions began. The combined army included approximately 3,000 Mercian warriors under Burgred's direct command, supplemented by 2,000 West Saxon troops led by King Ethelred and his brother Alfred. Additional contingents from smaller kingdoms brought the total force to perhaps 6,000 warriors, creating rough numerical parity with the Viking besiegers. The Anglo-Saxon leadership developed coordinated battle plans that called for simultaneous attacks against multiple Viking positions, while relief forces attempted to break through to the besieged garrison. This was it, the moment of truth. The largest Anglo-Saxon army since the invasion began, marching to break the Viking siege and prove that England could still fight back. The Battle of Nottingham, fought in March 868 AD, demonstrated both the tactical sophistication that the great heathen army had achieved and the persistent limitations of Anglo-Saxon military doctrine. The Viking commanders, led by Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson, had prepared extensively for the expected relief attempt. The siege camps had been positioned not merely to contain the town's defenders, but to create advantageous positions for engaging relief forces. Viking cavalry units remained concealed in nearby woodland, ready to strike Anglo-Saxon flanks once the main engagement began. The initial Anglo-Saxon assault achieved limited success as attacking forces overran some of the outer Viking positions. However, the Vikings had prepared layered defenses that drew the attackers into increasingly disadvantageous terrain while preserving their own tactical flexibility. As Anglo-Saxon forces advanced toward the main Viking camps, they encountered prepared obstacles, including concealed pits, sharpened stakes, and carefully positioned earthworks that disrupted their formations and exposed them to concentrated missile fire. The decisive moment came when Viking cavalry units emerged from concealment to strike the Anglo-Saxon flanks, while the main engagement continued around the siege works. The combination of surprise, superior tactical coordination, and advantageous positioning proved overwhelming for portions of the Anglo-Saxon army. However, unlike previous engagements, the Anglo-Saxon forces maintained sufficient cohesion to conduct an organized withdrawal rather than suffering complete destruction. Both Burgred and Ethelred survived the battle, though their army sustained casualties that significantly reduced their capacity for continued resistance. The aftermath of the Battle of Nottingham marked a crucial turning point in Viking conquest strategy. Rather than pursuing the retreating Anglo-Saxon forces, the Viking leadership chose to consolidate their territorial gains while opening diplomatic negotiations with the defeated kings. This decision reflected recognition that complete destruction of Anglo-Saxon military capacity might prove counterproductive, as the Vikings required cooperative local leadership to administer conquered territories effectively. The negotiations that followed established patterns of tribute payment and political subordination that would characterize Viking Anglo-Saxon relationships throughout the subsequent decade. The terms negotiated between the Vikings and King Burgred during the summer of 868 AD created a tributary relationship that preserved the formal structure of Mercian kingship while ensuring Viking control over the kingdom's military and economic resources. Burgred retained his royal title and continued to exercise authority over internal Mercian affairs, but his foreign policy decisions required Viking approval. The agreement established regular tribute payments that included silver, agricultural products, and military equipment, while also requiring Mercian forces to provide assistance for future Viking campaigns against remaining independent Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Mercia had not been conquered, it had been subjugated, and in many ways, that was worse. The tribute system implemented in Mercia demonstrated the sophisticated administrative concepts that the Viking leadership had developed during their conquest campaigns. Rather than imposing direct military occupation throughout the kingdom, the Vikings established a network of fortified positions at strategic locations, while relying on cooperative Anglo-Saxon administrators to collect revenues and maintain order. This approach minimized the military resources required for territorial control, while maximizing the economic benefits of conquest. The system proved so effective that it became the standard model for Viking administration throughout their English territories. The economic exploitation of Mercia, under Viking oversight, began immediately following the establishment of tributary relationships. Scandinavian merchants and craftsmen received preferential access to Mercian markets, while Viking officials supervised the collection and distribution of agricultural surpluses. The kingdom's silver mines came under direct Viking control, with production quotas established to ensure steady supplies of precious metals for military and diplomatic purposes. These economic arrangements generated substantial revenues that supported continued Viking military operations while providing incentives for Anglo-Saxon cooperation. The psychological impact of Mercia's subordination extended throughout remaining independent Anglo-Saxon territories. The kingdom's traditional role as the hegemon of central England meant that its submission to Viking authority fundamentally altered the political landscape of 9th century Britain. Smaller kingdoms that had previously looked to Mercia for protection against external threats now faced the choice between submission to Viking authority or attempting resistance with minimal external support. Most chose accommodation, recognizing that opposition would likely result in the same military destruction that had befallen Northumbria. King Burgred's personal response to his kingdom's subordination revealed the complex emotional and political pressures facing Anglo-Saxon rulers during this period. Contemporary sources suggest that Burgred struggled with the humiliation of tributary status, while recognizing the practical impossibility of successful resistance. The king's relationship with his own nobles became increasingly strained as various factions advocated different approaches to Viking domination. Some Mercian thegns argued for continued cooperation in hopes of preserving their lands and status, while others advocated renewed resistance despite its obvious risks. The gradual erosion of Burgred's authority occurred over several years, as Viking influence within Mercia expanded beyond the original tributary arrangements. Scandinavian advisors began participating in Mercian court proceedings, ostensibly to ensure compliance with tribute obligations, but effectively supervising all significant governmental decisions. Viking merchants established permanent operations in major Mercian towns, creating economic relationships that bound local populations to the new political order. The cumulative effect of these changes was to transform Mercia from an independent kingdom into a Viking protectorate. The crisis that ultimately led to Burgred's flight from England developed during 873 to 874 AD as internal opposition to his rule, combined with increasing Viking demands for expanded tribute payments. A faction of Mercian nobles, led by Ceolwulf, began advocating for Burgred's deposition in favor of a ruler who could provide more effective leadership against Viking domination. Simultaneously, the great heathen army increased its pressure on Mercia as part of preparations for renewed campaigns against Wessex. demanding additional warriors and supplies that strained the kingdom's resources beyond sustainable levels. The final confrontation between Burgred and his opponents occurred during the winter of 873 to 874 AD, when the king attempted to rally support for renewed resistance against Viking authority. However, years of tributary status had weakened both Mercian military capabilities and popular support for the monarchy. When Ceolwulf and his supporters openly challenged Burgred's authority, the king discovered that he lacked sufficient loyal forces to maintain his position. Rather than face capture and probable execution, Burgred chose exile, fleeing to Rome, where he spent his remaining years as a pensioner of the papal court. The installation of Ceolwulf II as Burgred's replacement demonstrated the sophisticated approach to governance that the Vikings had developed during their conquest campaigns. Rather than appointing a Scandinavian ruler who might provoke popular resistance, the Viking leadership selected an Anglo-Saxon noble whose genealogical claims provided legitimacy while ensuring his dependence on continued Viking support. Ceolwulf possessed sufficient noble lineage to satisfy traditional requirements for kingship, but his political position remained entirely dependent on Viking approval and military backing. Mercia was now a puppet state. The Vikings controlled everything that mattered, while allowing the Anglo-Saxons to maintain the illusion of independence. It was a masterpiece of political manipulation. And now, with Northumbria conquered and Mercia subjugated, only one major Anglo-Saxon kingdom remained independent: Wessex, the last hope of Anglo-Saxon England. By 869 AD, the Vikings controlled territory extending from the Scottish borders to the Thames Valley, commanding resources and manpower that dwarfed anything available to the West Saxon monarchy. The transformation of Mercia into a compliant client state had eliminated the buffer zone that previously protected Wessex from northern threats, while providing the Vikings with secure supply lines and additional military levies for future campaigns. The West Saxon kingdom that faced Viking invasion in 870 AD represented the culmination of centuries of political and military evolution within Anglo-Saxon England. King Ethelred, who had ruled since 865 AD, commanded a realm that stretched from the English Channel northward to the Thames Valley and westward to the Welsh borders. The kingdom's population approached 200,000 inhabitants, making it comparable in size to contemporary Frankish duchies and substantially larger than most Scandinavian political entities. This demographic advantage provided Wessex with potential military resources that exceeded Viking capabilities, though translating population into effective military power required sophisticated organizational systems that remained underdeveloped in 9th century England. The West Saxon military organization reflected both traditional Anglo-Saxon structures and innovations developed in response to increasing Viking pressure. The Feuard system theoretically enabled the mobilization of all free men for defensive warfare, though practical limitations meant that sustained campaigns relied primarily on the king's personal retinue and levies provided by major thegns. Archaeological evidence suggests that Wessex could field approximately 4,000 professional warriors, supported by 8,000 to 10,000 militia fighters during major campaigns. However, these forces remained dispersed across the kingdom's extensive territories and required weeks to assemble for coordinated operations. The economic foundations of West Saxon resistance proved more robust than those available to previously conquered Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The realm's agricultural productivity, concentrated in the fertile river valleys of the Test and Kennet, generated substantial grain surpluses that could sustain large armies throughout extended campaigns. The kingdom's position controlling cross-channel trade routes produced significant customs revenues, while silver mines in the Mendip Hills provided access to the precious metals necessary for weapon production and diplomatic negotiations. These resources enabled Wessex to maintain military forces on a scale that matched Viking capabilities while supporting the administrative infrastructure necessary for effective resistance. But resources alone would not be enough. The Vikings had proven that they could defeat larger armies through superior tactics and coordination. Wessex needed something more. Wessex needed Alfred. The Viking preparation for the Wessex campaign revealed the organizational sophistication that the great heathen army had achieved through their previous conquests. Intelligence gathering operations conducted throughout 869 AD provided detailed information about West Saxon defensive capabilities, political relationships, and economic vulnerabilities. Scandinavian merchants and craftsmen, operating under the protection of tributary arrangements in Mercia and East Anglia, established trading relationships that served as covers for military reconnaissance. These operations identified key river crossings, fortified positions, and supply depots that would prove crucial during subsequent military operations. The strategic planning process incorporated lessons learned from previous campaigns while adapting to the specific challenges posed by West Saxon resistance. Unlike Northumbria's political divisions or East Anglia's military weakness, Wessex presented a unified kingdom with experienced leadership and substantial military resources. The Viking commanders recognized that successful conquest would require systematic destruction of West Saxon military capacity, rather than the political maneuvering that had proved effective elsewhere. This analysis led to the development of campaign plans that emphasized rapid territorial conquest, combined with the elimination of Anglo-Saxon strongholds that could serve as centers of continued resistance. The invasion commenced during the winter months of 869 to 870 AD, when the great heathen army crossed the Thames at Reading, establishing a fortified base that controlled river traffic while providing secure communications with their Mercian territories. The selection of Reading reflected careful analysis of West Saxon defensive arrangements, as the town occupied a strategic position at the confluence of the Thames and Kennet rivers, while remaining sufficiently distant from major Anglo-Saxon strongholds to permit secure establishment of Viking operations. The crossing operation itself demonstrated the tactical innovations that distinguished this campaign from earlier Viking expeditions, with coordinated movements by multiple army divisions that prevented West Saxon forces from concentrating against any single crossing point. The fortification of Reading proceeded according to established Viking engineering principles, while incorporating modifications designed for extended territorial occupation. The army's engineers constructed earthwork defenses that utilized the natural advantages provided by the river confluence, while creating multiple defensive lines that could channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones. The fortifications included provisions for naval operations, with protected harbors that could accommodate the Viking fleet, while providing secure supply routes connecting the base with territories under Scandinavian control. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Reading fortifications represented some of the most sophisticated military engineering undertaken by Viking forces in England. The West Saxon response to the Viking invasion revealed both the kingdom's military strengths and the persistent limitations of Anglo-Saxon tactical doctrine. King Ethelred and his brother Alfred, who served as second in command, recognized that immediate action was necessary to prevent Viking consolidation of their Thames Valley bridgehead. The royal army, numbering approximately 3,000 warriors, advanced toward Reading within days of receiving reports about the Viking crossing. This rapid response reflected the superior communications and mobilization systems that Wessex had developed during previous decades of external pressure. The initial engagement at Reading occurred on January 4, 871 AD, when advanced elements of the West Saxon army encountered Viking forces constructing the outer defensive works. The battle demonstrated the tactical evolution that had occurred within both armies since their previous confrontations. The Vikings employed coordinated infantry and cavalry formations that maximized their advantages in mobility and weapon quality, while the Anglo-Saxons relied on traditional shield wall tactics that emphasized discipline and endurance over tactical flexibility. The engagement resulted in limited Viking tactical success, though neither side achieved decisive advantages that would determine the campaign's ultimate outcome. The psychological impact of the Reading engagement extended beyond its immediate tactical results, as both sides recognized that they faced opponents capable of sustained resistance. The Vikings discovered that West Saxon military capabilities exceeded those encountered in previous campaigns, while the Anglo-Saxons confirmed that Viking forces possessed the organizational sophistication necessary for territorial conquest rather than simple raiding. These realizations influenced subsequent strategic decisions by both sides, leading to more cautious approaches that emphasized preparation and coordination over rapid decisive action. And then came Ashdown. The Battle of Ashdown, fought on January 8, 871 AD, emerged as the most significant early engagement of the Wessex campaign and demonstrated the tactical innovations that would characterize subsequent Anglo-Saxon resistance efforts. The battle developed when West Saxon forces, commanded jointly by King Ethelred and Alfred, encountered the main Viking army positioned on the Berkshire Downs near modern-day Compton. The Vikings had selected defensive positions that utilized the natural advantages provided by elevated terrain while maintaining access to supply routes connecting their forces with the Reading base. The Viking battle formation reflected the military sophistication that the great heathen army had achieved through years of successful campaigning. The army deployed in two main divisions, with Halfdan Ragnarsson and Bagseg commanding the northern wing, while Ivar the Boneless and several other jarls controlled the southern formation. Each division included balanced combinations of heavy infantry, light infantry, and cavalry units that could respond flexibly to changing tactical circumstances. The Vikings positioned their forces to take maximum advantage of the sloping terrain, creating overlapping fields of fire for their archers while providing cavalry units with clear approach routes for flanking maneuvers. The Anglo-Saxon approach to the Battle of Ashdown demonstrated significant tactical evolution from previous engagements, reflecting lessons learned during earlier confrontations with Viking forces. King Ethelred commanded the northern division of the West Saxon army, facing Halfdan's Vikings, while Alfred led the southern wing against the forces under Ivar's command. This division of command responsibilities enabled more flexible tactical responses, while ensuring that both wings maintained coordination throughout the engagement. The Anglo-Saxon battle plan emphasized aggressive offensive action designed to prevent Viking forces from utilizing their superior mobility and tactical flexibility. But here is where the story gets incredible. The decisive moment of the battle occurred when Alfred's division launched a coordinated assault against the Viking southern wing before Ethelred's forces had completed their preparations. According to later sources, Ethelred was attending Mass and refused to leave until the service was complete. Alfred, seeing the Vikings beginning to advance, made a split-second decision that would change the course of English history. He attacked. This premature attack, which later sources suggest resulted from Alfred's tactical instincts rather than coordinated planning, caught the Vikings while they were still deploying from their march formation into battle array. The Anglo-Saxon assault struck the Viking line at its most vulnerable point, creating confusion and disorder that prevented effective tactical responses. Alfred's warriors pressed their advantage aggressively, breaking through Viking defensive formations and forcing Ivar's division into disorganized retreat. The success of Alfred's assault created opportunities for Ethelred's division to achieve similar tactical advantages against Halfdan's forces. The king's warriors, inspired by their comrade's success and facing Vikings whose confidence had been shaken by the southern wing's collapse, launched their own coordinated attack that overwhelmed the remaining Viking positions. The combination of surprise, aggressive execution, and superior numbers proved decisive, resulting in the most significant Anglo-Saxon victory achieved since the Viking invasions began. The battle cost the Vikings substantial casualties, including several prominent jarls, while demonstrating that coordinated Anglo-Saxon resistance could achieve tactical success against even experienced Viking forces. For the first time since 865 AD, the great heathen army had been decisively defeated in open battle, but the Vikings were far from finished. The aftermath of Ashdown provided crucial strategic lessons that influenced subsequent developments throughout the Wessex campaign. The Vikings discovered that their previous tactical assumptions about Anglo-Saxon military capabilities required substantial revision, while the West Saxons gained confidence that sustained resistance could achieve meaningful results. However, both sides also recognized that single battle outcomes would not determine the campaign's ultimate conclusion, as the fundamental strategic advantages remained relatively balanced between the opposing forces. The Viking response to the Ashdown defeat revealed the tactical flexibility and strategic depth that made the great heathen army such a formidable opponent. Rather than attempting immediate retaliation that might compound their losses, the Viking leadership chose to consolidate their remaining forces while seeking reinforcements from territories under Scandinavian control. New contingents arrived from Denmark and the Viking territories in Ireland, bringing the army's strength back to levels comparable with their pre-battle capabilities. These reinforcements included experienced warriors familiar with siege warfare techniques that would prove crucial during subsequent phases of the campaign. Over the following months, the war continued with brutal intensity. Battle followed battle, Wilton, Merton, and numerous smaller engagements that gradually wore down both sides. The Vikings won some, the Anglo-Saxons won others, but the cumulative effect was devastating for Wessex. The death of King Ethelred on April 23, 871 AD, created both opportunities and challenges for continued West Saxon resistance. Ethelred's death occurred following wounds received during the Battle of Merton, fought on March 22, where Viking forces had achieved tactical victory through superior coordination and battlefield mobility. The succession of Alfred to the West Saxon throne proceeded smoothly due to previous arrangements that recognized his military capabilities and popular support among the kingdom's warrior elite. However, Alfred inherited a realm whose military resources had been substantially depleted through months of continuous campaigning against Viking forces. Alfred was now king, but he was king of a kingdom on the brink of destruction. In 871 AD alone, the West Saxons fought 9 major battles against the Vikings. 9. Their army was exhausted, their treasury depleted, their best warriors dead or wounded. Alfred made a decision that must have been agonizing. He paid the Vikings to leave. The payment of Danegeld, tribute money to buy peace, was not a sign of weakness. It was a strategic necessity. Alfred needed time. Time to rebuild his army, time to develop new strategies, time to create the military innovations that would eventually turn the tide. The Vikings accepted the payment and withdrew from Wessex, turning their attention to other targets. but everyone knew they would be back. The question was whether Alfred would be ready when they returned. Alfred's accession marked the beginning of a new phase in Anglo-Saxon resistance strategy that emphasized systematic military reform over traditional tactical approaches. The new king recognized that previous Anglo-Saxon defeats had resulted primarily from organizational and tactical limitations rather than fundamental resource disadvantages. Alfred's early reforms focused on improving communication systems that could coordinate military responses across the kingdom's extensive territories, while developing logistical capabilities that could sustain extended campaigns without depleting local agricultural resources. But Alfred was not just a military reformer. He was a visionary who understood that defeating the Vikings would require a complete transformation of how Anglo-Saxon England defended itself. The development of the burr system represented Alfred's most significant innovation in defensive strategy, though its implementation required several years of careful planning and resource allocation. The concept involved establishing a network of fortified towns positioned to control major river crossings and road junctions throughout West Saxon territory. Each burh would maintain a permanent garrison capable of independent defensive action, while providing secure bases for larger military operations. The system required substantial investment in construction materials, skilled labor, and ongoing maintenance, but offered the potential for coordinated defensive responses that could neutralize Viking mobility advantages. Think about what this meant. For centuries, the Vikings had relied on their speed and mobility to strike before defenders could organize. They would appear suddenly, raid a target, and disappear before any army could respond. Alfred's burr system changed everything. Now, no matter where the Vikings struck, there would be a fortified position nearby with warriors ready to respond. The Vikings could no longer move freely through West Saxon territory. Every road, every river crossing, every strategic location was covered. The initial burh construction began during 871 to 872 AD, with fortifications at strategic locations including Wallingford, Cricklade, and Oxford. These installations utilized both natural defensive advantages and sophisticated engineering techniques that incorporated lessons learned from Viking siege warfare. The fortifications included multiple defensive lines, protected water supplies, and internal storage facilities that could sustain garrisons during extended siege operations. Archaeological evidence suggests that the early burhs represented some of the most advanced military architecture constructed in 9th century Europe. Alfred's naval reforms addressed another crucial limitation in previous Anglo-Saxon resistance efforts: the inability to contest Viking control of river and coastal transportation routes. The king initiated construction of a West Saxon fleet, designed specifically to engage Viking longships in riverine and coastal environments. The new vessels incorporated design elements from captured Viking ships while adapting to Anglo-Saxon tactical requirements and available construction materials. The shipbuilding program required recruitment of experienced shipwrights from continental Europe, as Anglo-Saxon naval traditions had atrophied during previous centuries of land-based military focus. The tactical evolution of Anglo-Saxon military doctrine under Alfred's leadership reflected systematic analysis of previous defeats and careful study of successful Viking techniques. The king established training programs that taught West Saxon warriors to fight effectively in flexible formations rather than relying exclusively on traditional shield wall tactics. These innovations included cavalry units equipped and trained according to Frankish models, archer formations capable of providing sustained missile support, and specialized siege warfare units that could operate effectively against fortified positions. Alfred was essentially reverse engineering the Viking military machine and creating an Anglo-Saxon version that could match it. The Viking adaptation to Alfred's military reforms demonstrated the tactical flexibility that had made the great heathen army successful throughout their English campaigns. Recognizing that traditional raiding tactics would prove ineffective against the developing Burr system, the Viking leadership began emphasizing siege warfare techniques and coordinated operations designed to overwhelm individual fortifications before relief forces could arrive. The army's engineers developed portable siege equipment that could be transported rapidly between targets, while maintaining the mobility advantages that form the foundation of Viking tactical doctrine. The campaign of 876 to 877 AD witnessed the most intensive phase of Viking operations against Alfred's reformed military system. The great heathen army, now commanded primarily by Guthrum, following the departure of other leaders to establish settlements in conquered territories, launched coordinated attacks against multiple Burrs, while attempting to prevent Anglo-Saxon forces from achieving tactical concentration. The Vikings achieved initial success at several locations, demonstrating that individual fortifications remained vulnerable to determined assault by superior forces. However, the systematic nature of Alfred's defensive preparations gradually began to limit Viking operational effectiveness. The Burr system created multiple secure bases that could support Anglo-Saxon military operations while denying the Vikings the rapid territorial conquest that had characterized their previous campaigns. West Saxon forces could now operate from fortified positions that provided both tactical advantages and logistical security, enabling sustained resistance efforts that gradually exhausted Viking resources and manpower. The war had become a stalemate. Neither side could achieve decisive victory. The Vikings could not break through Alfred's defensive network, but Alfred could not drive them out of England. Something had to give. And then, in the winter of 877 to 878 AD, everything changed. The crisis that ultimately led to the Treaty of Chippenham developed during the winter of 877 to 878 AD, when Guthrum attempted a final decisive campaign designed to destroy remaining West Saxon resistance. What happened next would become one of the most dramatic episodes in English history. It was Twelfth Night, January 6, 878 AD. The Christmas celebrations were barely over. Alfred was at his royal estate at Chippenham, surrounded by his court, his family, and his closest advisors. The army had been dismissed for the winter, as was customary. No one expected an attack. The Vikings struck without warning. Guthrum had led his army in a forced march through the winter darkness, covering distances that should have been impossible. The attack caught Alfred completely off guard. The royal estate was overrun. Alfred's household troops were scattered or killed. The king himself barely escaped with his life, fleeing into the night with only a handful of loyal followers. Within days, the news spread across Wessex: the king was gone. The Vikings controlled Chippenham. The last Anglo-Saxon kingdom was falling. The initial Viking success forced Alfred to retreat to the Somerset marshes, where he established a temporary base at Athelney that provided security while enabling continued coordination of resistance efforts. Athelney was a small island in the middle of the Somerset levels, a vast expanse of marshland that was virtually impassable to anyone who did not know the secret paths through the bogs and waterways. It was the perfect hiding place for a king on the run. The months that followed were the lowest point of Alfred's life. He had lost his kingdom, his army was scattered, his people were submitting to Viking rule. According to later legends, Alfred was reduced to such poverty that he was forced to take shelter in a peasant's cottage, where he was famously scolded by the housewife for letting her cakes burn. while he sat lost in thought about his kingdom's fate. Whether the story of the burned cakes is true or not, it captures something essential about this period. Alfred had lost everything. He was a king without a kingdom, a warrior without an army, a leader without followers. Most men would have given up. Most men would have fled to the continent, as other Anglo-Saxon kings had done before him. Alfred did not give up. From his refuge in the marshes, Alfred began rebuilding. He sent messengers throughout Wessex, calling his loyal Fens to rally to his banner. He gathered intelligence about Viking movements and dispositions. He planned his counterattack with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized his military reforms. The Vikings, meanwhile, believed they had won. Guthrum was consolidating his control over Wessex, accepting submissions from Anglo-Saxon nobles, and preparing to divide the kingdom among his followers. He had no idea that Alfred was still alive, still fighting, still planning. In May 878 AD, Alfred emerged from the marshes. The king had sent word throughout Wessex, calling all loyal men to meet him at Egbert's Stone on the edge of Selwood Forest. When Alfred arrived, he found an army waiting for him. Warriors had come from Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire. Men who had refused to submit to Viking rule. Men who had been waiting for their king to return. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that when the men of Wessex saw Alfred, they rejoiced as if he had risen from the dead. Alfred led his army toward the Viking positions, and on a day in May 878 AD, the two forces met near a place called Edington. The Battle of Edington represented the culmination of 7 years of warfare between the great heathen army and Alfred's reformed military forces. The engagement occurred when Alfred's army, reinforced by levies from throughout Wessex, encountered Guthrum's forces positioned near modern-day Westbury. The battle demonstrated the tactical evolution that had occurred within both armies during their extended conflict, with sophisticated formations and coordinated maneuvers that reflected years of military innovation and adaptation. The Anglo-Saxon victory at Edington resulted from superior tactical coordination, combined with the cumulative effects of Alfred's military reforms. The West Saxon army employed flexible formations that neutralized Viking mobility advantages while maintaining sufficient cohesion to resist cavalry charges and flanking maneuvers. Alfred had learned from every previous battle, every previous defeat. He knew exactly how the Vikings fought, and he had trained his men to counter every tactic. The battle was fierce and bloody, lasting most of the day. But gradually, the Anglo-Saxon line pushed forward. The Vikings began to waver, and then they broke. Guthrum's army fled the field, retreating to their fortified camp at Chippenham. Alfred pursued, surrounding the Viking position and laying siege. For 2 weeks the Vikings held out, but they had no hope of relief. Their army was shattered, their supplies exhausted, their morale destroyed. Finally, Guthrum surrendered. The subsequent Treaty of Chippenham, negotiated during the summer of 878 AD, established the political framework that would govern Viking Anglo-Saxon relationships for the remainder of the 9th century. The agreement recognized Viking control over territories north and east of a boundary running roughly from London to Chester, creating the political entity known as the Danelaw. Simultaneously, the treaty confirmed Alfred's authority over remaining West Saxon territories while establishing diplomatic protocols that regulated trade, legal proceedings, and military activities across the boundary. But the treaty included something else, something that demonstrated Alfred's understanding of the deeper forces at work in this conflict. Guthrum agreed to be baptized as a Christian, with Alfred himself serving as his godfather. The baptismal ceremony that formalized Guthrum's conversion took place at Aller in Somerset. The religious ritual included the adoption of the Christian name Ethelstan, which connected Guthrum to Anglo-Saxon royal traditions while maintaining his authority over Viking followers. The ceremony attracted substantial attention from both Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon observers, creating a precedent that would influence subsequent conversions among Viking leaders throughout the Danelaw territories. Alfred had not just defeated Guthrum militarily, he had begun the process of integrating the Vikings into English Christian civilization. It was a masterstroke of political and cultural strategy that would have consequences lasting for centuries. The great heathen army's era of conquest was over, but the transformation of England was just beginning. The establishment of the Danelaw boundary through the Treaty of Chippenham marked a crucial inflection point in the great heathen army's operational strategy, as the unified force that had terrorized Anglo-Saxon England for over a decade began to fragment along lines that reflected both practical necessities and fundamental disagreements about future objectives. The massive military confederation that had conquered kingdoms and reshaped the political landscape of 9th century Britain now faced internal pressures that would ultimately transform raiders into settlers and create the foundations for permanent Scandinavian communities throughout northern and eastern England. The decision to divide the great heathen army emerged from a confluence of factors that had been building throughout the extended campaign against Alfred's reformed military system. Years of continuous warfare had exhausted both human and material resources, while the establishment of stable territorial boundaries reduced the immediate prospects for further profitable conquest. Many warriors who had joined the expedition seeking rapid wealth through traditional raiding activities found themselves committed to prolonged siege operations and administrative duties that offered limited opportunities for personal enrichment. The demographic composition of the army had also evolved significantly, as marriages with local women and the birth of children created family obligations that competed with military service for individual loyalties. But the real division was philosophical. The leadership tensions that precipitated the army's division reflected deeper disagreements about the ultimate objectives of Scandinavian expansion in England. Halfdan Ragnarsson, who had emerged as the dominant figure in Northumbrian affairs following the conquest of York, advocated for systematic colonization that would create permanent Scandinavian territories capable of supporting large populations through agricultural production and trade. This vision required substantial investment in infrastructure development, legal systems, and administrative structures that could govern mixed populations of Scandinavians and Anglo-Saxons. Halfdan's supporters included many warriors who had acquired local landholdings and established family relationships that bound them to specific geographical areas. Guthrum's faction maintained greater commitment to traditional Viking objectives of wealth extraction and territorial expansion, viewing the current territorial arrangements as temporary expedients rather than permanent settlements. His supporters included younger warriors who had joined the expedition seeking adventure and enrichment, along with recent arrivals from Scandinavia who lacked the local connections that influenced Halfdan's followers. Guthrum's strategic vision emphasized maintaining military readiness for renewed campaigns against remaining Anglo-Saxon territories, particularly if political circumstances created opportunities for further conquest in Wessex or the Welsh kingdoms. The practical implications of these strategic disagreements became apparent during the winter planning sessions of 873 to 874 AD, when the army's leadership attempted to coordinate responses to Alfred's continuing military reforms. Halfdan's forces had become increasingly focused on defensive operations designed to protect established settlements and agricultural investments in Northumbrian territory. His warriors had developed local knowledge and relationships that made them highly effective at maintaining control over conquered populations, but reduced their mobility and availability for extended campaigns in distant territories. The gradual transformation from mobile raiders to territorial defenders represented a fundamental shift in military priorities that created operational constraints for the unified army. Guthrum's contingents retained greater tactical flexibility and mobility, but faced increasing logistical challenges as their traditional supply networks became disrupted by the establishment of permanent territorial boundaries. The warriors under his command required regular infusions of wealth and supplies that could only be obtained through continued military operations. Yet the stabilization of Anglo-Saxon resistance under Alfred's leadership had reduced opportunities for profitable raiding. The tension between military necessity and available resources created pressures that could only be resolved through either renewed territorial expansion or fundamental changes in operational strategy. The formal division of the Great Heathen Army occurred during the spring of 874 AD, when Halfdan announced his intention to lead his followers northward to establish permanent settlements in Northumbrian territory. This decision represented more than a simple redistribution of military forces. It constituted a fundamental transformation in the nature of Scandinavian presence in England. Halfdan's departure, with approximately 3,000 warriors and their families, marked the end of the unified military confederation that had dominated English affairs for nearly a decade, while simultaneously beginning the process of systematic colonization that would create lasting Scandinavian communities throughout northern England. The land distribution process that followed Halfdan's return to Northumbria revealed sophisticated understanding of both agricultural requirements and political necessities involved in successful colonization. The Viking leadership recognized that sustainable settlement required more than simple military occupation. It demanded the creation of economic relationships that could support large populations while maintaining political stability among conquered Anglo-Saxon communities. The distribution system that emerged incorporated elements of traditional Scandinavian land tenure, with practical adaptations designed for the specific circumstances of colonial administration. Individual warriors typically received holdings ranging from 30 to 120 acres, depending on their military rank and family circumstances, with additional common lands available for grazing livestock and gathering timber. The distribution process prioritized fertile river valley locations that could support intensive agricultural production, while also ensuring that each settlement maintained defensive positions that could resist potential Anglo-Saxon counterattacks. The resulting settlement pattern created a network of fortified agricultural communities that could provide mutual support while maintaining economic productivity. The transformation of Viking warriors into agricultural settlers required substantial adaptations in both lifestyle and social organization. Many Scandinavian colonists possessed limited experience with the intensive farming techniques necessary for successful agriculture in English soil and climate conditions. The settlement process therefore incorporated extensive cooperation with existing Anglo-Saxon populations whose agricultural knowledge proved essential for successful crop production. This collaboration created complex social relationships that blended Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon cultural elements, while establishing new forms of economic organization that differed significantly from traditional patterns in either society. The legal frameworks developed for governing mixed Scandinavian Anglo-Saxon communities reflected pragmatic approaches to the challenges of colonial administration. Halfdan's administration established court systems that incorporated elements of both Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon legal traditions. creating hybrid institutions that could resolve disputes involving members of both communities. The resulting legal codes addressed issues ranging from property rights and inheritance procedures to criminal penalties and commercial regulations, establishing precedents that would influence legal development throughout the Danelaw territories for centuries. The linguistic impact of mass Scandinavian settlement became apparent within decades of the initial colonization, as extensive contact between Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon populations created new dialectical variations that incorporated elements from both language families. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites indicates that bilingual communication became common in areas with substantial Scandinavian populations, leading to the development of creolized languages that facilitated trade and administration while preserving distinct cultural identities. The linguistic changes extended beyond simple vocabulary borrowing to include fundamental alterations in grammatical structures and pronunciation patterns that would permanently influence the development of the English language in northern regions. Meanwhile, Guthrum continued his military operations in East Anglia and periodic campaigns against Wessex, demonstrating the persistent viability of traditional Viking strategies under appropriate circumstances. The forces remaining under Guthrum's command, numbering approximately 4,000 warriors, retained the mobility and tactical flexibility that had characterized the original Great Heathen Army, while adapting to the changed strategic environment created by Alfred's military reforms and the establishment of territorial boundaries. Guthrum's administrative approach in East Anglia differed significantly from Halfdan's colonization strategy, emphasizing the extraction of wealth and resources rather than permanent settlement and agricultural development. The East Anglian territories under Viking control functioned primarily as military bases and supply centers that could support continued operations against remaining Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. This approach required different organizational structures and administrative systems that prioritized military efficiency over long-term economic development or cultural integration. The Great Heathen Army was no more. In its place were two distinct Scandinavian presences in England, Guthrum's settled kingdom in East Anglia and Halfdan's warrior bands in Northumbria. This division would prove to be one of the most consequential moments in English history. Though few recognized it at the time, the unified force that had terrorized four kingdoms for over a decade had fractured along lines that would shape the political geography of Britain for centuries to come. Guthrum, now baptized as Aethelstan, faced the monumental task of transforming himself from a Viking warlord into a Christian king. This was not merely a change of title or religion, it was a complete reimagining of identity, governance, and purpose. The man who had led thousands of warriors in brutal campaigns across England now had to learn the arts of peace, taxation, law-giving, church administration, and diplomatic correspondence. His warriors, accustomed to the freedom of the raid and the glory of battle, had to become farmers, merchants, and subjects. The transition was neither smooth nor complete. Many of Guthrum's followers chafed under the restrictions of settled life. They had come to England seeking wealth and glory, not the tedious work of plowing fields and paying taxes. Some drifted away, joining other Viking bands or returning to Scandinavia. Others adapted, finding that the rich lands of East Anglia offered opportunities for prosperity that raiding could never match. The soil was fertile, the rivers teemed with fish, and the established trade networks promised steady income for those willing to engage in commerce rather than plunder. Guthrum established his capital at a location that would allow him to control the major routes through his kingdom while maintaining access to the sea. His court became a strange hybrid of Viking and Anglo-Saxon traditions. Norse was spoken alongside Old English, Pagan customs persisted beneath a thin veneer of Christianity. The old gods were not forgotten. They were simply worshipped more quietly, in private ceremonies that the priests chose not to notice. This religious syncretism would characterize the Danelaw for generations, creating a unique cultural blend that was neither fully Scandinavian nor fully English. The legal system that emerged in Guthrum's kingdom reflected this cultural fusion. Danish law, with its emphasis on personal honor and blood price compensation, merged with Anglo-Saxon traditions of written codes and royal justice. The result was a legal framework that satisfied neither purists from either tradition, but proved remarkably effective at maintaining order. Disputes were settled through a combination of oath-taking, witness testimony, and trial by ordeal, methods familiar to both cultures. The Wergild system, which assigned monetary values to human lives based on social status, was adapted to include both Danish and English categories of rank. Meanwhile, in Northumbria, Halfdan faced different challenges. His decision to divide the land among his followers in 876 had created a warrior aristocracy that owed its position entirely to military service. These men expected to be rewarded with continued opportunities for glory and plunder. When Halfdan attempted to lead them on a campaign to Ireland in 877, seeking to claim the Viking kingdom of Dublin, the expedition ended in disaster. Halfdan was killed in battle, leaving his followers leaderless and his nascent kingdom in chaos. The power vacuum in Northumbria attracted ambitious men from across the Viking world. Various warlords attempted to establish themselves as kings, leading to a period of instability that would last for decades. The Anglo-Saxon population, caught between competing Viking factions, suffered terribly. Churches that had survived the initial conquest were now plundered by new arrivals who felt no obligation to honor treaties made by their predecessors. The brief hope that Halfdan's settlement might bring peace was shattered by the reality of Viking political culture, which valued personal prowess over institutional continuity. This contrast between the relative stability of Guthrum's East Anglia and the chaos of Northumbria was not lost on contemporary observers. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, though written from a Wessex perspective, noted the difference between Vikings who kept their oaths and those who did not. Guthrum, despite his history of broken promises, had apparently learned from his defeat at Edington. He understood that his kingdom's survival depended on maintaining peaceful relations with Wessex. Alfred, for his part, seems to have recognized that a stable Christian Viking kingdom on his border was preferable to the alternative of endless warfare against ever-changing enemies. The Treaty of Wedmore, formalized in the agreement known as Alfred and Guthrum's Treaty, established the boundary between their kingdoms with remarkable precision. The border followed the River Thames to its junction with the River Lee, then up the Lee to its source, then in a straight line to Bedford, and finally along the River Ouse to Watling Street, the ancient Roman road that ran diagonally across England. This boundary would define the Danelaw, the region where Danish law prevailed, for generations to come. But what did this boundary mean in practice? For the people living along its length, it meant divided families, disrupted trade routes, and constant uncertainty. A farmer whose fields straddled the border might find himself subject to two different legal systems, two different tax collectors, two different lords. Merchants had to navigate the complexities of doing business across a cultural and legal divide. Churches found their dioceses split, their authority challenged, their revenues diminished. Yet the boundary also created opportunities. Trade between the two regions flourished, as each had goods the other wanted. The Danelaw produced surplus grain, wool, and leather. Wessex offered manufactured goods, wine imported from the continent, and the prestige items that Viking leaders craved as symbols of their status. The border towns became centers of exchange, their markets drawing buyers and sellers from both sides. This economic interdependence created constituencies for peace in both kingdoms. Merchants and craftsmen, who prospered from trade and had no desire to see it disrupted by renewed warfare. Alfred used the years of peace to implement the most ambitious program of reform in Anglo-Saxon history. His military reorganization went far beyond the burst system, though that remained its centerpiece. He divided the traditional Anglo-Saxon militia, into two parts so that half the eligible men were always available for service while the other half tended their farms. This rotation system ensured that Wessex could maintain a standing force without destroying its agricultural economy. It was a solution to a problem that had plagued medieval kingdoms for centuries: how to maintain military readiness without impoverishing the peasantry. The burhs themselves were more than fortifications. Alfred conceived them as integrated urban centers that would serve military, economic, and administrative functions simultaneously. Each burh was assigned a garrison based on its size, with one man required for every pole, about 5 meters, of wall. The Burgal Hidage, a document that survives from this period, lists 33 burhs with their assigned garrisons, revealing a system of remarkable sophistication. The total garrison strength exceeded 27,000 men, a number that suggests Alfred could mobilize a force larger than any the great heathen army had fielded. But Alfred's vision extended beyond mere defense. He wanted the burhs to become centers of trade and manufacture, drawing population from the countryside and creating a new urban class that would be loyal to the crown. To achieve this, he offered incentives to merchants and craftsmen who settled within the walls. He established mints in the major burhs, ensuring a reliable supply of currency for commerce. He built roads connecting the burhs, facilitating both military movement and trade. The result was a network of fortified towns that transformed the economic geography of Wessex. The naval dimension of Alfred's reforms deserves special attention. The Anglo-Saxons had never been a seafaring people in the way the Vikings were. Their ships were designed for coastal trade and river transport, not for the open sea voyages that brought Viking raiders to their shores. Alfred recognized that as long as the Vikings controlled the seas, England would remain vulnerable to attack. He therefore commissioned the construction of a new type of warship, larger than the Viking longships, with higher sides that would give his men an advantage in boarding actions. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that Alfred's ships were almost twice as long as the others. Some had 60 oars, some more. They were both swifter and steadier, and also higher than the others. These vessels represented a significant investment of resources and a bold experiment in naval architecture. Whether they were truly superior to Viking ships is debatable. The Chronicle also records that they were sometimes too large to navigate shallow waters where Viking ships could operate freely. But their construction demonstrated Alfred's willingness to innovate and his understanding that the Viking threat could not be defeated by land forces alone. Alfred's intellectual and cultural reforms were equally ambitious. He lamented the decline of learning in England, noting that when he came to the throne, there were very few men south of the Humber who could understand their service books in Latin or translate a letter from Latin into English. This decline was partly the result of Viking destruction. Monasteries had been the centers of learning, and many had been destroyed or abandoned. But Alfred also blamed the complacency of earlier generations, who had allowed standards to slip even before the Viking invasions. His solution was characteristically comprehensive. He established a court school where the sons of nobles would receive education in both Latin and English. He invited scholars from Mercia, Wales, and the continent to join his court, creating an intellectual community that could produce the translations and original works he envisioned. He personally participated in the translation of several important texts, including Pope Gregory's Pastoral Care, Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, and the first 50 Psalms. These translations were not merely academic exercises. They were intended to provide the educated laity with access to the wisdom of the Christian tradition in their own language. The preface to Alfred's translation of the Pastoral Care is one of the most remarkable documents of the early medieval period. In it, Alfred reflects on the decline of learning in England and outlines his program for revival. He orders that a copy of the translation be sent to every bishopric in his kingdom, along with an aestel, a pointer used for reading, worth 50 mancuses, a substantial sum. He expresses his hope that all freeborn young men in England might learn to read English, with those destined for higher office continuing to Latin. This vision of widespread literacy was revolutionary for its time and would not be fully realized for centuries. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle itself was probably begun during Alfred's reign, possibly at his direct instigation. This year-by-year record of events, maintained at various monasteries and eventually compiled into a continuous narrative, is our primary source for the history of this period. Its perspective is unabashedly pro-Wessex and pro-Alfred, but its existence testifies to the importance Alfred placed on historical memory. He understood that the struggle against the Vikings was not just a military contest, but a battle for the soul of the English people. By recording their history, he was helping to create a sense of shared identity that would outlast any individual king or kingdom. The legal reforms attributed to Alfred are preserved in a law code that combines new legislation with selections from earlier codes. Alfred's laws begin with a lengthy preface that traces the history of law from Moses through the early church councils to the codes of earlier English kings. This historical framework was not mere antiquarianism. It was a deliberate attempt to place Alfred's legislation within a tradition of divinely sanctioned lawgiving. By linking his laws to Moses and the apostles, Alfred claimed for them an authority that transcended mere royal decree. The substance of Alfred's laws reflects the concerns of a society recovering from decades of warfare. There are provisions for the protection of churches and clergy, for the maintenance of oaths and pledges, for the regulation of blood feuds, and for the rights of lords over their dependents. The penalties prescribed are severe by modern standards, but were typical of the period. What distinguishes Alfred's code is its systematic organization and its attempt to balance the demands of justice with the realities of a violent society. The blood feud, for example, is not abolished but regulated. Families are given time to seek compensation before resorting to violence, and the king's peace is extended to protect those who have paid the required wargild. Perhaps most significantly, Alfred's laws establish the principle that the king is the ultimate source of justice in his realm. While earlier codes had recognized the authority of local lords and kindred groups, Alfred's legislation consistently emphasizes royal jurisdiction. Crimes committed in the king's presence are punished more severely. The king's word is given special weight in legal proceedings. The king's peace, the protection extended to those under royal authority, becomes a central concept in English law. This assertion of royal supremacy over justice would have profound implications for the development of English government in subsequent centuries. The religious dimension of Alfred's reforms cannot be separated from their political and military aspects. Alfred saw the Viking invasions as divine punishment for the sins of the English people, particularly their neglect of learning and religion. His program of revival was therefore as much spiritual as practical. By restoring monasteries, promoting education, and enforcing Christian morality, he hoped to regain God's favor and ensure the survival of his kingdom. This interpretation of history as divine judgment was common in the medieval period, but Alfred applied it with unusual consistency and energy. The monasteries that Alfred founded or restored became centers of the reform movement. Athelney, where he had taken refuge during his darkest hour, was transformed into a monastery that would commemorate his deliverance. Shaftesbury was established as a nunnery, with Alfred's daughter Aethelgifu as its first abbess. These foundations were not merely acts of piety, they were strategic investments in the infrastructure of Christian civilization. Monasteries provided education, preserved manuscripts, offered hospitality to travelers, and served as centers of local administration. By rebuilding the monastic network, Alfred was rebuilding the institutional framework of his kingdom. The relationship between Alfred and Guthrum during these years of peace remains somewhat mysterious. The sources tell us little about their interactions after the Treaty of Wedmore, but the absence of conflict suggests that both men honored their commitments. Guthrum ruled East Anglia until his death in 890, maintaining the peace that had been established at Edington. His coins, which survive in significant numbers, show him using his baptismal name Ethelstan and employing Christian imagery. Whether this represented genuine conversion or political calculation is impossible to know, but it demonstrates his commitment to the terms of his agreement with Alfred. The death of Guthrum in 890 marked the end of an era. He was the last of the great leaders of the great heathen army, the final link to the invasion that had begun a quarter-century earlier. His successors in East Anglia lacked his authority and his understanding of the delicate balance that maintained peace with Wessex. The stage was being set for a new phase of conflict, one that would test Alfred's reforms and determine whether his achievements would endure. But before that new conflict erupted, Alfred had one more challenge to face. A challenge that would come not from the settled Vikings of the Danelaw, but from a new wave of invaders from across the sea. The great heathen army had been defeated and divided, but the Viking world had not forgotten England. New warlords were gathering their forces, new fleets were being built, and new campaigns were being planned. The peace that Alfred had won at such cost was about to be tested as never before. What happens when you've built the perfect defense, and then an even larger army arrives? The year 892 brought news that chilled the blood of every man, woman, and child in England who remembered the horrors of the great heathen army. A massive Viking fleet had gathered in Boulogne, on the coast of Francia, and its destination was unmistakable. This was no raiding party seeking quick plunder. This was an invasion force of unprecedented size comprising 250 ships and thousands of warriors. They had brought their families with them, their horses, their livestock, and all their possessions. They had come to conquer, to settle, to make England their home. The leader of this new invasion was a warlord named Hastin, whose reputation preceded him like a dark cloud. Hastin had spent decades raiding across Europe, from the coasts of Spain to the rivers of Francia, from the Mediterranean to the Baltic. He had sacked cities, defeated armies, and accumulated wealth beyond counting. Now, in his old age, he sought a kingdom of his own, and England, weakened by decades of warfare, divided between Saxon and Dane, seemed ripe for the taking. But Hastin had made a critical miscalculation. The England he was invading was not the England of 865. Alfred had spent 15 years preparing for exactly this moment. The Burr system was complete, a network of fortified towns that covered Wessex like a shield. The Fyrd had been reorganized, trained, and equipped. The navy that Alfred had built patrolled the coasts, ready to intercept enemy fleets. Most importantly, the people of Wessex had learned from their previous defeats. They knew what was at stake, and they were determined not to repeat the mistakes of the past. The Viking fleet made landfall at 2 locations simultaneously, a strategy designed to divide the English response. The main force, under Hastin, landed at Milton in Kent and immediately began constructing a fortified camp. A second force landed at Appledore, some 20 miles to the south, and did the same. Between them, they controlled the approaches to the heart of Wessex, threatening to cut the kingdom in two. Alfred's response demonstrated the effectiveness of his reforms. Rather than rushing to confront either Viking force directly, he positioned his army between them, preventing them from uniting while keeping both under observation. He sent messengers to the burhs, ordering their garrisons to stand ready. He dispatched his son Edward and his son-in-law Ethelred, the ealdorman of Mercia, to lead separate forces that could respond to Viking movements. The days of a single royal army chasing Vikings across the countryside were over. Alfred had created a military system that could operate on multiple fronts simultaneously. The campaign that followed was unlike anything England had seen before. It was a war of maneuver, of sieges, of strategic patience. The Vikings, accustomed to facing enemies who would either flee or fight pitched battles, found themselves confronting an opponent who refused to do either. When they marched, English forces shadowed them. When they stopped to forage, they found the countryside stripped bare, the population sheltered behind the walls of the burhs. When they attacked a burh, they found walls too strong to storm and garrisons too numerous to overwhelm. Hastain attempted to break the stalemate through negotiation. He sent envoys to Alfred, offering to accept baptism and swear oaths of peace, the same strategy that had worked for Guthrum 15 years earlier. Alfred, perhaps remembering how many times Guthrum had broken similar oaths before Eddington, was skeptical. But he agreed to meet with Hastain, and a treaty was concluded. Hastain's two sons were baptized, with Alfred and Ethelred standing as their godfathers. Hostages were exchanged, oaths were sworn, and peace was declared. The peace lasted approximately as long as it took for Hastain to resupply his forces. Within weeks, the Vikings were on the move again, raiding and plundering as if no treaty had ever been signed. Alfred's response was swift and merciless. He attacked Hastain's camp at Benfleet while the Viking leader was away on a raid, capturing his wife, his children, and a vast quantity of plunder. The ships that the Vikings had laboriously hauled up from the coast were either seized or burned. It was a devastating blow, one that demonstrated both Alfred's military capability and his willingness to use it. But Hastain was not defeated. He regrouped his forces and launched a bold strike deep into English territory, marching up the Thames Valley and then turning north toward the Danelaw. His strategy was clear. He hoped to link up with the Scandinavian settlers in Northumbria and East Anglia, creating a unified Viking front that would overwhelm Alfred's defenses. If he succeeded, everything Alfred had built would be destroyed. The race that followed was one of the most dramatic episodes in English history. Alfred's forces pursued Hastain across the breadth of England, fighting running battles and trying to prevent him from reaching his allies. The Vikings moved with desperate speed, abandoning their baggage and their wounded in their haste to escape. The English, equally desperate, pushed themselves to the limits of endurance. For weeks, the two armies played a deadly game of cat and mouse across the English Midlands. The climax came at Buddington, on the Welsh border, where the Vikings found themselves trapped between Alfred's pursuing army and a Welsh force that had come to join the English. Surrounded and starving, the Vikings attempted a breakout. The battle that followed was one of the bloodiest of the entire war. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that the Vikings suffered great slaughter and that many of their leaders were killed. But enough survived to continue the fight, escaping eastward toward the Danelaw. What happened next revealed the fundamental weakness of Hastain's strategy. The Vikings of the Danelaw, whom he had counted on as allies, proved reluctant to join his cause. Guthrum was dead, and his successors had no desire to restart a war that had cost them so dearly. The settlers who had received land in Northumbria and East Anglia had too much to lose from renewed conflict. They had farms, families, and futures that depended on peace. Hastine's call for a united Viking front fell on deaf ears. This was perhaps Alfred's greatest achievement, not the military victories, impressive as they were, but the political transformation he had wrought. By defeating Guthrum and then making peace with him, by allowing the Vikings to settle and prosper under English overlordship, Alfred had created a situation where the Scandinavian population of England had more to gain from peace than from war. The great heathen army had been defeated not just on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of its descendants. Hastine's campaign sputtered on for another 2 years, but it was a losing cause. His forces, depleted by battle and desertion, could no longer threaten the major centers of English power. They raided where they could, seized what plunder they could carry, and gradually dispersed. Some joined the existing Viking settlements in the Danelaw. Others returned to the continent. Hastane himself disappears from the historical record after 896, his dreams of an English kingdom unfulfilled. The victory over Hastane's invasion was the crowning achievement of Alfred's military career. He had faced an enemy larger and more experienced than the great heathen army, and had defeated it without fighting a single pitched battle. His strategy of defense in depth, of fortified towns and mobile reserves, of economic warfare and political manipulation, had proven superior to the traditional Viking tactics of raid and conquest. The military revolution he had begun after Edington was now complete. But Alfred did not rest on his laurels. The years following Hastine's defeat saw continued refinement of his defensive system. New burhs were constructed, existing ones strengthened. The navy was expanded, with new ships built to Alfred's specifications. The Fyrd was reorganized yet again, with clearer chains of command and better provisions for supply and logistics. Alfred understood that the Viking threat had not disappeared. It had merely been contained. Future generations would face new invasions, and they would need the tools to defeat them. The final years of Alfred's reign were marked by a gradual transition of power to the next generation. His son Edward, who had proven himself in the campaigns against Hastane, took on increasing responsibility for military affairs. His daughter Ethelflaed, married to Ethelred of Mercia, became a powerful figure in her own right, eventually ruling Mercia after her husband's death and earning the title Lady of the Mercians. Alfred was building not just a kingdom but a dynasty, one that would carry forward his vision of a united English nation. Alfred died on October 26, 899, after a reign of nearly 30 years. He was approximately 50 years old, an advanced age for the time, especially for a man who had spent much of his life in military campaigns. The cause of his death is unknown, though he had suffered from a painful illness throughout his adult life, possibly Crohn's disease or some similar chronic condition. Despite this affliction, he had accomplished more than any English king before him and most who came after. The legacy Alfred left behind was extraordinary. He had inherited a kingdom on the verge of extinction and transformed it into the most powerful state in Britain. He had defeated the greatest military threat the island had ever faced and created a defensive system that would protect his successors for generations. He had revived learning and literacy, established a legal framework that would endure for centuries, and laid the foundations for the eventual unification of England. No wonder later generations would call him the Great, the only English monarch to bear that title. But Alfred's greatest legacy was perhaps the least tangible. He had given the English people a sense of themselves as a nation. Before Alfred there were Mercians and Northumbrians, East Anglians and West Saxons, separate peoples with separate identities, united only by language and a vague sense of common heritage. After Alfred, there was the beginning of something new, an English identity that transcended regional boundaries, a shared history of struggle and survival, a common destiny. The great heathen army had come to destroy the English kingdoms. Instead, it had forged them into a nation. Alfred saved England. His children would reclaim it. Edward the Elder inherited his father's kingdom in 899, but he also inherited his father's enemies. The Vikings of the Danelaw had remained quiet during Alfred's final years, but they had not forgotten their ambitions. The death of the great king seemed to offer an opportunity. Surely his untested son could not match his achievements. Surely the elaborate defensive system Alfred had built would crumble without his guiding hand. Surely the time had come to resume the conquest that the great heathen army had begun. They were wrong. Edward proved to be every bit his father's equal as a military commander, and in some ways his superior. Where Alfred had been forced to fight defensively, struggling to preserve what remained of English independence, Edward could take the offensive. The system of burhs that Alfred had built was not just a defensive network, it was a platform for expansion. Each fortified town could serve as a base for operations into Viking territory, a secure point from which English forces could project power into the Danelaw. Edward's strategy was methodical and relentless. He would advance into Viking territory, construct a new burh, garrison it with troops, and then use it as a base for the next advance. Each new fortification extended English control a few miles further. Each new garrison made the previous gains more secure. It was slow work, measured in years rather than months, but it was inexorable. The Vikings, who excelled at rapid movement and sudden strikes, found themselves facing an enemy who refused to be rushed, who absorbed their attacks and kept advancing. The key to Edward's success was his partnership with his sister Athelflaed. After her husband Ethelred's death in 911, Athelflaed ruled Mercia in her own right, commanding armies and building fortifications with a skill that matched her brother's. Together they coordinated a two-pronged advance into the Danelaw, Edward pushing north from Wessex, while Athelflaed pushed east from Mercia. The Vikings, caught between two advancing fronts, could not concentrate their forces against either. Athelflaed's achievements deserve special recognition. In an age when women were expected to remain in the domestic sphere, she led armies in battle, negotiated treaties with Welsh princes, and directed the construction of fortifications across Mercia. The burhs she built, at Tamworth, Stafford, Warwick, and elsewhere, were as formidable as any her father had constructed. Her warriors called her Myrtna Hleifdij, Lady of the Mercians, and followed her with a loyalty that any king might envy. The campaigns of 917 marked the turning point of the Reconquest. In that single year, Edward and Aethelflaed captured Derby, Leicester, and Nottingham, 3 of the 5 major Viking strongholds in the Danelaw. The speed of these conquests shocked contemporaries. Towns that had been Viking for 40 years fell in a matter of weeks. Armies that had terrorized the English countryside for generations surrendered without a fight. The momentum had shifted decisively, and everyone knew it. The Vikings who submitted to Edward and Aethelflaed were not expelled or massacred. Instead, they were incorporated into the English kingdom, allowed to keep their lands and their customs in exchange for acknowledging English overlordship. This policy of integration, rather than extermination, was crucial to the success of the Reconquest. It meant that each Viking town that surrendered became a source of strength, rather than a continuing problem. The Scandinavian settlers, who had feared losing everything, found that English rule offered security and stability. Many became loyal subjects of the English crown. Aethelflaed died in June 918, just as the Reconquest was reaching its climax. She had lived to see Derby and Leicester fall, but not the final submission of the Danelaw. Her death was a blow to Edward, who had relied on her partnership for nearly a decade. But it also simplified the political situation. Aethelflaed's daughter Elfwin, briefly succeeded her as Lady of the Mercians, but Edward moved quickly to bring Mercia under direct West Saxon control. For the first time since the 7th century, a single ruler controlled all of England south of the Humber. The final phase of Edward's reconquest came in 920, when the kings of the Scots, the Strathclyde Welsh, and the Northumbrian Vikings all acknowledged him as father and lord. This submission, recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, marked the high point of Edward's reign. He had not merely recovered the territories lost to the great heathen army, he had extended English influence further than it had ever reached before. The dream of a united Britain, which had seemed impossible just a generation earlier, now appeared within reach. Edward died in 924, having reigned for 25 years. His achievements rivaled those of his father, though history has been less generous in remembering them. Where Alfred is celebrated as the savior of England, Edward is often overlooked as merely the man who finished what his father started. This is unfair. The reconquest of the Danelaw required military and political skills of the highest order. Edward demonstrated both in abundance. The throne passed to Edward's son Athelstan, who would prove to be the greatest warrior king of the entire dynasty. Athelstan had been raised at the Mercian court, educated by his aunt Ethelfled, and trained in the arts of war from childhood. He combined his grandfather's intellectual curiosity with his father's military prowess, creating a formidable combination. His reign would see the final unification of England and the establishment of English hegemony over the entire island of Britain. Athelstan's first challenge was to secure control of Northumbria, the last major region outside English rule. The Viking kingdom of York had maintained its independence throughout Edward's reign, its rulers playing the English and the Scots against each other to preserve their autonomy. Athelstan ended this game in 927, when he drove out the Viking king Guthfrith and annexed Northumbria to the English crown. For the first time in history, a single king ruled all of England. But Athelstan's ambitions extended beyond England. He sought recognition as the paramount ruler of Britain, overlord of the Welsh, the Scots, and the Strathclyde Britons. Through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic skill, he achieved this goal. The Welsh kings attended his court and witnessed his charters. The Scottish king Constantine II acknowledged his supremacy. Even the Viking rulers of Dublin, across the Irish Sea, treated with him as an equal. Athelstan styled himself King of the English and ruler of all Britain, a title that, for once, was not mere boasting. The culmination of Athelstan's reign came in 937 at the Battle of Brunanburh. A grand coalition had formed against him. Constantine of Scotland, Olaf Guthfrithson of Dublin, and the kings of Strathclyde, united in their determination to break English power. Their combined army was the largest hostile force to invade England since the Great Heathen Army. If they won, everything that Alfred, Edward, and Athelstan had built would be destroyed. The battle that followed was the bloodiest in English history to that point. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, usually restrained in its language, breaks into heroic verse to describe the carnage. Never yet in this island was there a greater slaughter of a host made by the edge of the sword, as the books tell us. The old authorities, since from the east the Angles and Saxons came hither, sought Britain over the broad seas, proud warsmiths who overcame the Welsh, glory-eager earls who won a homeland. Athelstan's victory was complete. 5 kings and 7 earls fell on the enemy side. Constantine fled back to Scotland, his army shattered. Olaf escaped to Dublin with the remnants of his fleet. The threat to English unity was broken, and it would not arise again for another generation. Athelstan died in 939, just 2 years after his greatest triumph. He was succeeded by his half-brother Edmund, who faced the immediate challenge of a Viking resurgence. Olaf Guthfrithson recovered from his defeat at Brunanburh, invaded Northumbria, and briefly re-established Viking rule in York. Edmund spent his short reign fighting to recover what had been lost, a task he had nearly completed when he was murdered by an outlaw in 946. The pattern of the following decades was one of advance and retreat, as successive English kings struggled to maintain control of Northumbria against Viking claimants from Dublin and Scandinavia. The Kingdom of York changed hands repeatedly, sometimes English, sometimes Viking, never quite secure for either side. It was not until 954, when the last Viking king of York, Eric Bloodaxe, was killed in battle, that Northumbria was finally and permanently incorporated into the English kingdom. The death of Eric Bloodaxe marked the end of an era that had begun with the landing of the great heathen army nearly 90 years earlier. The Viking kingdoms that had once controlled most of England were gone, absorbed into a unified English state. The Scandinavian settlers remained, their descendants forming a significant portion of the population in the former Danelaw, but they were now English subjects, not Viking conquerors. The transformation that Alfred had begun was complete. They came as conquerors. They stayed as neighbors, and they changed England forever. The integration of the Danelaw into the English kingdom was not merely a political event. It was a cultural transformation that would shape English identity for centuries to come. The Scandinavian settlers who had arrived as warriors and raiders became farmers, merchants, and craftsmen. Their language merged with Old English, contributing thousands of words that remain in use today. Their legal customs influenced English law. Their artistic traditions blended with Anglo-Saxon styles to create new forms of expression. The England that emerged from the Viking Age was fundamentally different from the England that had existed before. The linguistic legacy of the Vikings is perhaps the most visible aspect of their influence. Everyday English words like sky, egg, window, husband, wrong, take, give, and they all derive from Old Norse. Place names across northern and eastern England reveal the extent of Scandinavian settlement. Any town ending in by, farmstead, thorp, village, thwaite, clearing, or toft, homestead, was originally a Viking foundation. The very word law comes from Old Norse lag, a reminder that the Vikings brought not just violence but also systems of governance. The legal influence of the Danelaw persisted long after political unification. The region retained distinctive customs that set it apart from the rest of England. The wapentake, a unit of local government equivalent to the hundred in southern England, took its name from the Old Norse word for weapon taking, the ceremonial brandishing of weapons that signified assent in Scandinavian assemblies. Juries of 12 men, a practice that would eventually become central to English common law, may have originated in Scandinavian legal traditions. The very concept of outlawry, declaring a person outside the protection of the law, was a Viking import. The social structure of the Danelaw also differed from that of Wessex and Mercia. The Scandinavian settlers had brought with them a tradition of free peasant proprietorship that contrasted with the more hierarchical arrangements of Anglo-Saxon England. In the Danelaw, a higher proportion of the rural population held their land freely, without the obligations of labor service that bound peasants elsewhere. This tradition of relative freedom would persist for centuries, contributing to the distinctive character of northern and eastern England. The religious transformation of the Danelaw was equally significant. The Vikings who settled in England were pagans, worshippers of Odin, Thor, and the other gods of the Norse pantheon. Their conversion to Christianity was gradual and incomplete, a process that took generations rather than years. The early converts often maintained dual allegiances, honoring Christ on Sundays while continuing to invoke the old gods in times of crisis. Archaeological evidence reveals amulets that combine Christian crosses with Thor's hammers, suggesting a pragmatic approach to divine protection. The churches that emerged in the Danelaw reflected this cultural fusion. Stone crosses carved with scenes from Norse mythology stood in churchyards alongside traditional Christian imagery. The Gosforth cross in Cumbria, for example, depicts both the crucifixion and scenes from Ragnarok, the Norse apocalypse. These hybrid monuments testify to a society in transition, working out the relationship between old beliefs and new faith. The artistic legacy of the Vikings is visible in the distinctive style known as ringerike and urns, characterized by flowing, interlaced patterns of animals and foliage. This Scandinavian aesthetic influenced Anglo-Saxon art, contributing to the development of the late Anglo-Saxon style that would flourish in the 10th and 11th centuries. Manuscript illumination, metalwork, and stone carving all show the influence of Viking artistic traditions, creating a visual culture that was neither purely English nor purely Scandinavian, but something new. The economic impact of the Viking settlement was profound. The Scandinavians were traders as well as raiders, and they brought England into closer contact with the commercial networks of the Baltic and the North Sea. York, under Viking rule, became one of the great trading cities of northern Europe, its markets drawing merchants from as far as Byzantium and Baghdad. Archaeological excavations at Coppergate in York have revealed a thriving urban economy, with workshops producing goods for both local consumption and long-distance trade. The coinage of the Danelaw reflects this commercial sophistication. Viking rulers minted coins that imitated Anglo-Saxon designs, facilitating trade across the cultural boundary. Some coins bear the names of Viking kings in runic script, while others use Latin letters and Christian symbols. This numismatic evidence reveals a society that was adapting to English norms while maintaining its distinctive identity. The military legacy of the Vikings was equally enduring. The tactics and weapons that the great heathen army had brought to England became part of the English military tradition. The two-handed axe, the quintessential Viking weapon, was adopted by English warriors and would remain in use until the Norman conquest and beyond. The shield wall, the basic tactical formation of Viking warfare, became standard in English armies. Even the longship, that supreme achievement of Scandinavian naval architecture, influenced English shipbuilding, though the English never fully mastered the art of open sea navigation that made the Vikings so formidable. The political legacy of the Viking Age was the unification of England itself. Before the great heathen army, England was divided among 4 major kingdoms and numerous smaller polities. The Viking invasions destroyed 3 of those kingdoms and nearly destroyed the 4th. But from the ashes of destruction emerged a unified state, forged in the crucible of war and tempered by the challenge of reconquest. Alfred's Wessex became the nucleus around which a New England crystallized, absorbing Mercia, East Anglia, and Northumbria into a single realm. This unification was not inevitable. It required the vision of Alfred, the military skill of Edward and Athelstan, and the political acumen of generations of administrators and churchmen. It required the cooperation of the Scandinavian settlers, who chose integration over continued resistance. It required the development of new institutions, the burr system, the reformed fyrd, the network of shires and hundreds, that could govern a territory larger than any previous English kingdom. The England that emerged from the Viking Age was a new creation, built on the ruins of the old. The memory of the Viking Age became central to English national identity. The struggles of Alfred and his successors were celebrated in chronicles, poems, and later in histories that shaped how the English understood themselves. The image of Alfred as the wise king who saved his people from destruction became a founding myth of the English nation, invoked in times of crisis as a reminder of what courage and determination could achieve. The Vikings themselves were transformed in memory from terrifying invaders into worthy adversaries whose defeat demonstrated English valor. This mythologization began early. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled during Alfred's reign and continued by his successors, presented the Viking Wars as a struggle between Christian civilization and pagan barbarism, between English virtue and Scandinavian vice. Later writers elaborated on this theme, adding legendary elements that obscured the historical reality. The story of Alfred burning the cakes, for example, first appears in a biography written nearly a century after his death, and probably has no basis in fact. But such legends served a purpose, humanizing the great king and making his story accessible to ordinary people. The Danelaw itself became a symbol of the Viking presence in England, a reminder that the invaders had not merely passed through, but had settled and stayed. The distinctive customs and dialects of the region persisted for centuries, marking it as different from the rest of England. Even today, genetic studies reveal a higher proportion of Scandinavian ancestry in the populations of Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, and East Anglia, the heartland of the old Danelaw. Just when England thought the nightmare was over, it began again. The death of Eric Bloodaxe in 954 seemed to mark the end of the Viking threat to England. For a generation, the kingdom enjoyed relative peace, its borders secure, its institutions stable, its economy flourishing. The descendants of Alfred had achieved what had seemed impossible. They had not only survived the Viking onslaught, but had emerged stronger than before. England was now the most powerful kingdom in the British Isles, its king acknowledged as overlord by Welsh princes and Scottish kings alike. But across the North Sea, forces were gathering that would shatter this peace. The Scandinavian homelands were undergoing a transformation of their own. The petty kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were consolidating into larger, more powerful states. Christianity was spreading, bringing with it new ideas about kingship and governance, and a new generation of Viking leaders was emerging, men who combined the martial traditions of their ancestors with the organizational capabilities of Christian monarchs. The first sign of renewed danger came in 980, when Viking raids resumed along the English coast. These were not the massive invasions of the 9th century, but smaller, more opportunistic attacks, testing probes to assess English defenses and English resolve. What the raiders found was encouraging. The burr system that Alfred had built was falling into disrepair. The Fyrd was poorly trained and poorly led. The navy that had once patrolled the coasts had been allowed to decay. England, grown complacent in its security, was vulnerable. The man who would exploit this vulnerability was Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark. Sweyn was everything that a Viking king should be: brave, cunning, ambitious, and utterly ruthless. He had seized the Danish throne by driving his own father into exile. He had extended Danish power across Scandinavia, forcing the kings of Norway and Sweden to acknowledge his supremacy. Now he turned his attention to England, the richest prize in northern Europe. Sweyn's campaigns against England began in 991 and would continue, with interruptions, for over 2 decades. His strategy was different from that of the great heathen army. Rather than seeking to conquer and settle, he aimed to extract tribute, vast payments of silver that would finance his ambitions elsewhere. The English, faced with armies they could not defeat, agreed to pay. The first payment, in 991, amounted to 10,000 pounds of silver. Subsequent payments grew larger: 16,000 pounds in 994, 24,000 pounds in 1002, 36,000 pounds in 1007, 48,000 pounds in 1012. These payments, known as Danegeld, represented an enormous transfer of wealth from England to Scandinavia. Archaeological evidence confirms the scale of this extraction. English coins from this period have been found in vast quantities across Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, testimony to the effectiveness of Sweyn's extortion. The burden fell heavily on the English population, who were taxed repeatedly to raise the necessary funds. The Danegeld became a permanent feature of English government, continuing to be collected long after the Viking threat had passed. The English king during most of this period was Ethelred, known to history as the Unready, a nickname that derives from the Old English unread, meaning poorly counseled or ill-advised. Ethelred's reign was marked by faction and treachery, as competing noble families struggled for influence at court. His military responses to the Viking threat were consistently ineffective, hampered by poor leadership, inadequate resources, and the treachery of his own subjects. The contrast with Alfred could not have been starker. The low point of Ethelred's reign came in 1002, when he ordered the massacre of all Danes living in England. This atrocity, known as the St. Brice's Day Massacre, was intended to eliminate a potential fifth column, but succeeded only in provoking Sweyn to greater fury. Among those killed was Sweyn's sister Gunhilde, giving the Danish king a personal motive for vengeance. The massacres also alienated the Scandinavian population of the Danelaw, who had been loyal subjects of the English crown for generations. Ethelred had managed to unite his enemies while dividing his own kingdom. Sweyn's response was devastating. His campaigns of 1003 to 1005 laid waste to large areas of southern England, burning towns, slaughtering populations, and demonstrating the impotence of English resistance. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the destruction in terms that echo the darkest days of the great heathen army. They went as they pleased, and no army would face them. The burhs that Alfred had built, neglected and undermanned, fell one after another. The military system that had saved England a century earlier had been allowed to decay, and now the price was being paid. The final crisis came in 1013, when Sweyn launched a full-scale invasion aimed not at tribute, but at conquest. Landing in the Humber, he marched south through the Danelaw, where the Scandinavian population welcomed him as a liberator. Town after town submitted without resistance. By the end of the year, Sweyn controlled all of England north of the Thames. Ethelred, abandoned by his subjects, fled to Normandy with his family. Sweyn was acknowledged as King of England. But Sweyn's triumph was brief. He died on February 3, 1014, just 5 weeks after completing his conquest. His death threw everything into confusion. His son Canute, who had accompanied him to England, was too young and too inexperienced to hold the kingdom together. The English nobles, seeing an opportunity, invited Ethelred to return. The exiled king landed with an army, and Canute was forced to withdraw to Denmark. Ethelred's restoration was as troubled as the rest of his reign. He faced rebellion from his own son Edmund, who controlled much of the Danelaw. He faced renewed invasion from Canute, who returned in 1015 with a massive fleet. He faced the hostility of nobles, who had submitted to Sweyn and now feared retribution. When Ethelred died in April 1016, he left a kingdom in chaos, its future uncertain. The struggle for England now came down to two men: Edmund, Ethelred's son, known as Ironside for his courage in battle, and Canute, Sweyn's son, determined to claim his father's conquest. Their war was fought across the length of England, from Wessex to Northumbria, in a series of bloody battles that recalled the campaigns of the great heathen army. Edmund proved to be a far more capable commander than his father, winning several engagements and rallying English resistance. But Canute had the resources of Denmark behind him. and he could replace his losses while Edmund could not. The decisive battle came at Sundon in Essex in October 1016. The English army, weakened by months of campaigning and betrayed by one of its own commanders, was destroyed. Edmund escaped with a handful of followers, but his cause was lost. A few weeks later, the two kings met and agreed to divide England between them. Edmund would rule Wessex, Cnut the rest. It was a compromise that satisfied neither side, and it lasted only a month. Edmund died on November 30th, 1016, possibly murdered, possibly from wounds received at Sandon, and Cnut became sole king of England. The Vikings finally won, but in winning, they became English. Cnut's conquest of England in 1016 represented the fulfillment of the dream that had driven the great heathen army 150 years earlier. A Scandinavian king now ruled the wealthiest kingdom in northern Europe. The descendants of Alfred, who had saved England from Viking conquest, were dead or in exile. The long struggle between English and Danes seemed to have ended in Danish victory. But history is full of ironies, and the greatest irony of the Viking Age was this: in conquering England, the Vikings were themselves conquered. Cnut did not rule England as a foreign occupier, imposing Scandinavian customs on a subject population. Instead, he ruled as an English king, adopting English institutions, English laws, and English traditions. He married Ethelred's widow Emma, linking himself to the old royal dynasty. He patronized English churches, endowed English monasteries, and promoted English churchmen to positions of power. He even made pilgrimage to Rome, presenting himself as a Christian monarch in the European tradition. Cnut's reign was, by most measures, a success. He brought peace to a kingdom that had known little but war for a generation. He reformed the administration, strengthening royal authority while respecting local customs. He maintained the legal traditions of both the English and the Danelaw, issuing law codes that drew on both traditions. He defended England against external threats, using his control of Denmark and Norway to neutralize the Viking menace that had plagued his predecessors. Under Cnut, England was not a conquered province, but the center of a North Sea empire. The integration of England into Cnut's empire brought benefits as well as costs. English merchants gained access to markets across Scandinavia and the Baltic. English churchmen carried Christianity to the remaining pagan areas of the north. English administrative techniques influenced the development of government in Denmark and Norway. The cultural exchange that had begun with the settlements of the 9th century continued and deepened, creating connections that would persist for centuries. But Cnut's empire was a personal creation, held together by his own abilities and reputation. When he died in 1035, it immediately began to fragment. His sons proved incapable of maintaining his legacy. Harold Harefoot, who ruled England from 1035 to 1040, was a weak and unpopular king. Harthacnut, who succeeded him, was little better. When Harthacnut died in 1042, the male line of Cnut's dynasty was extinct, and the English nobles turned to the old royal family for a successor. The man they chose was Edward, son of Ethelred and Emma, who had spent most of his life in exile in Normandy. Edward, later known as the Confessor for his piety, represented a restoration of the House of Wessex, a return to the dynasty that Alfred had founded. His reign would be the last chapter of Anglo-Saxon England, a final flowering before the catastrophe of 1066. Edward's reign was peaceful but troubled by the question of succession. He had no children, and the various claimants to his throne: Harold Godwinson, the most powerful English noble; William, Duke of Normandy, who claimed Edward had promised him the crown; Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, who claimed to have inherited Cnut's rights, would plunge England into crisis after his death. The Norman conquest that followed would transform England more thoroughly than the Viking invasions ever had, replacing the English aristocracy with a French-speaking elite. and introducing new systems of government, law, and landholding. But the legacy of the Viking Age endured. The England that William conquered in 1066 was not the England of 865. It was a unified kingdom, with established institutions, a sophisticated administration, and a strong sense of national identity. These were the achievements of Alfred and his successors, forged in the struggle against the great heathen army and its successors. The Normans inherited this legacy and built upon it, creating the medieval English state that would eventually become the most powerful kingdom in Europe. The Scandinavian element in English society also endured. The descendants of the Viking settlers remained in the Danelaw, their distinctive customs and dialects persisting for centuries. The English language, enriched by thousands of Norse loanwords, became a hybrid tongue that was neither purely Germanic nor purely Romance, but something uniquely English. The legal traditions of the Danelaw influenced the development of English common law, contributing concepts like the jury trial that would become central to the Anglo-American legal tradition. The memory of the Viking Age became part of English national mythology. Alfred the Great was celebrated as the founder of the English nation, the wise king who had saved his people from destruction. The struggles of his successors were remembered as a heroic age, when English valor had triumphed over foreign invasion. This mythology served political purposes, invoked by later rulers to legitimize their authority and inspire their subjects. But it also reflected a genuine historical achievement, the survival and eventual triumph of English civilization in the face of existential threat. The great heathen army had come to England seeking wealth, land, and glory. Its warriors had achieved all three, but not in the way they had intended. The wealth they sought was absorbed into the English economy. The land they conquered became part of the English kingdom. The glory they won was transformed into the glory of their descendants, who became English in all but ancestry. The Vikings had changed England forever, but England had changed them as well. In the end, the story of the great heathen army is not just a story of invasion and conquest. It is a story of transformation, of two peoples who met as enemies and became one nation. It is a story of destruction and creation, of the death of old kingdoms and the birth of a new one. It is a story of individuals, Ivar the Boneless and Alfred the Great, Guthrum and Edward the Elder, Sweyn Forkbeard and Canute, whose choices shaped the destiny of millions. And it is a story that continues to resonate today, in the language we speak, the laws we follow, and the identity we claim. The Vikings are gone, but their legacy endures. Every time an English speaker uses a word of Norse origin, every time a jury delivers a verdict, every time someone invokes the memory of Alfred the great heathen army lives on. They came as conquerors, stayed as settlers, and became ancestors. Their story is our story, and it is far from over. If you've made it this far, you've just experienced one of the greatest transformations in European history. The great heathen army didn't just change England, it created it. Drop a comment below. Which moment surprised you the most? And don't forget to subscribe for more epic history that shaped our world.